On the morning of June 22nd, 1611, a man was dragged from his cabin in his nightclothes. His hands were bound behind his back with rough cord while the subarctic dawn poured pale light through the open hatchway above. Around him, the ship creaked and groaned as it freed itself from months of ice. The same ice that had imprisoned them all winter in the most desolate bay on Earth. The man was Henry Hudson, captain of the Discovery, the most experienced Arctic navigator alive, and the crew he had led into this frozen wasteland was about to repay him with a death sentence. They brought his son up next. John Hudson was perhaps 18 years old. No one recorded his exact age because no one involved in what happened that morning was much concerned with preserving details that might later serve as the evidence. The boy was shoved across the deck toward his father. Then came the sick, the loyal, and the inconvenient. 7 more men pulled or carried from below, some too weak from scurvy and starvation to stand without help. 9 souls in total, assembled on a deck slick with meltwater while armed mutineers blocked every path back to safety. Alongside the Discovery bobbed the ship's shallop, an open boat perhaps 20 feet long, designed for short excursions in sheltered coastal waters. It had no deck, no cabin, no provisions worth mentioning. The mutineers forced all 9 men into it. Someone tossed down a handful of personal effects, and then they cut the tow line. The Discovery's sails caught the wind. The gap between the ship and the shallop widened, 10 feet 30, 100. On the larger vessel, men who had sailed with Hudson for months, who had eaten his food and navigated by his charts, turned their backs and busied themselves with the rigging. In the shallop, 9 men watched their only connection to civilization grow smaller against the gray expanse of James Bay. Henry Hudson, his teenage son, and 7 companions were never seen again. Not a body, not a bone, not a scrap of clothing washed ashore. They simply ceased to exist, swallowed by the same vast, indifferent geography that Hudson had spent his life trying to master. What makes this story extraordinary is not the mutiny itself. The age of exploration was rife with treachery, and captains were overthrown with depressing regularity. What makes it extraordinary is what happened afterward. The men who set Hudson adrift sailed home on his ship carrying his maps and his charts. They were questioned by English authorities. There was talk of a trial. It never materialized because England needed what those men carried in their heads: the location of the massive bay, the navigational data, the knowledge of currents and ice patterns and coastlines that Hudson had risked everything to gather. The mutineers were not punished. They were debriefed, and then they were hired for the next voyage. One of them, Robert Bylot, went on to a distinguished career in Arctic exploration, his name attached to geographic features of its own. Henry Hudson got a rowboat, and in perhaps the most haunting detail of all, nobody ever went back to look for him. This is the story of a man who reshaped the map of the world and was erased from it. A navigator so brilliant and so impossible to work for that 4 separate expeditions ended in some form of disaster, and yet each disaster left behind discoveries so valuable that empires fought over them. The river that bears his name became the gateway to the American interior and the foundation upon which New York City was built. The bay that bears his name became the largest bay on Earth, the engine of the Canadian fur trade, and the reason a commercial company founded in 1670 still operates today, more than 3.5 centuries later. The strait that bears his name opened the door to the Canadian Arctic. A man with no known birth date, no confirmed birthplace, and no grave left a geographic fingerprint larger than most kings. To understand how it happened, how a single navigator could achieve so much, alienate so many, and vanish so completely, we need to begin with what little we know about where he came from, and then follow him across 4 increasingly desperate voyages into the ice. The primary accounts of Hudson's voyages come from a handful of men who sailed with him and either kept journals or later provided testimony. For the first 2 voyages, we rely heavily on the accounts preserved by the English clergyman and historian Samuel Purchas, who collected first-hand narratives of exploration in his monumental work Purchas His Pilgrims, published in 1625. Purchas personally interviewed returning sailors, collected ships' logs, and compiled what remains our richest source for English voyages of the period. For the third voyage, the account of Robert Juet, Hudson's first mate, the same man who would later help orchestrate the mutiny, provides a day-by-day record of extraordinary detail and barely concealed resentment. And for the fatal fourth voyage, we have the journal of Habakkuk Prickett, a representative of the voyage's financial backers who was aboard the Discovery throughout, a man who claimed to have opposed the mutiny, though his survival and his suspiciously self-serving account suggest a more complicated relationship with the events he described. These are imperfect witnesses. Several of them had direct reasons to shape the narrative in their own favor, but they are what we have. And reading between their lines, cross-referencing their contradictions, and measuring their words against the physical geography they describe, a portrait emerges. Not of a hero or a villain, but of a deeply complicated man consumed by a single idea. Henry Hudson materialized in the historical record the way a ship emerges from fog, gradually, without clear origin, and already in motion. We do not know when he was born. We do not know where he was born. We do not know who his parents were with any certainty, though circumstantial evidence has led most historians to connect him to a prominent London merchant family. A Henry Hudson helped found the Muscovy Company in 1555, the English trading venture that held a royal monopoly on northeastern exploration. If our Henry Hudson was his grandson, as many scholars believe, then the navigator grew up in a household where conversation at meals turned on the price of Russian furs, the navigability of Arctic seas, and the obsessive pursuit of a northeastern passage from Europe to Asia. This distinction matters because of what it tells us about the world Hudson inhabited. London at the turn of the 17th century was a city in the grip of a geographic fever. The great question consuming every merchant house, every royal court, every ship's captain who could read a chart was this: how do you get to China without going around Africa or South America? The Portuguese controlled the route south around the Cape of Good Hope. The Spanish controlled the western route through the Strait of Magellan. For England and the Netherlands, two rising maritime powers with expanding appetites and limited access, the only remaining options lay to the north. Over the top of Russia, perhaps, where the ice might thin enough in summer to allow passage. Or over the top of the world itself, straight across the North Pole, where ancient geographers had theorized the ice might give way to open water warmed by 24 hours of continuous summer sun. These theories were not the fantasies of uneducated dreamers. They were held by the finest cartographers and geographers of the age. The Reverend Richard Hakluyt, England's foremost collector of voyage narratives, believed in the Northeast Passage. The great Flemish geographer Gerardus Mercator, whose projection of the globe remains the most widely used map format in history, believed the polar sea might be navigable. Even the hard-nosed merchants of the Muscovy Company, men who measured the world in profit and loss, considered the search commercially viable enough to fund repeated expeditions. The logic was seductive. If you could find a northern route to the spice markets of Asia, you would cut thousands of miles off the journey, bypass your competitors entirely, and control a trade route of almost incalculable value. Into this environment of geographic ambition and commercial hunger stepped Henry Hudson. By the time he appeared in the records in 1607, he was already an experienced mariner. Experienced enough that the Muscovy Company entrusted him with command of their flagship northern expedition. He was not a young man learning his trade. He was a seasoned captain selected for the most important navigational assignment England had to offer. Whatever his life had been before that date, whatever voyages he had sailed, whatever skills he had accumulated, whatever relationships he had built or burned, had prepared him well enough to earn the confidence of the most powerful commercial entity in England. But we know almost nothing about those formative years. The silence itself is telling. Hudson left behind no personal letters that survive, no diary entries from his youth, no record of early voyages. What we have instead is the testimony of the men who sailed with him in the final 4 years of his life, and their portrait is remarkably consistent. A navigator of extraordinary skill and intuition, a leader of bewildering inconsistency, and a man who could not stop himself from pushing beyond every reasonable limit that geography, weather, and human endurance attempted to impose. He was, in the simplest terms, a man who could always see the next horizon and could never see the men standing in front of him. The Muscovy Company's instructions for the 1607 voyage were specific and audacious. Hudson was to sail north, not northeast along the Russian coast as previous expeditions had attempted, but directly over the top of the world across the North Pole itself and down the other side to Japan and China. The theory was Mercator's, that the polar ice cap surrounded a ring of frozen sea, but at the very pole itself, continuous summer sunlight might create an open channel of navigable water. It was an idea that would not be definitively disproven for another 3 centuries. In 1607, it was the cutting edge of geographic thought. Hudson departed from Gravesend on the Thames on May 1, 1607, aboard the Hopewell, a vessel so small that its entire crew numbered somewhere between 10 and 12 men. Among them was his son John, already serving as a member of the crew, a boy learning the Arctic from the deck of his father's ship, absorbing the rhythms of ice navigation, the reading of wind and current, the daily calculus of risk that defined life in the far north. The Hopewell sailed north along the coast of England, crossed the North Sea, and pushed into waters that few European vessels had ever entered. By June, they had reached the east coast of Greenland, where Hudson recorded something that would prove far more significant than he could have known. The waters near the coast were unusually warm, and along the shoreline and in the surrounding seas, whales were present in extraordinary numbers. Great pods of bowhead and right whales moving through waters so rich in marine life that the surface seemed to churn with their passage. Hudson noted the observation in his log and pressed northward. He was not a whaler. He was searching for a passage. The whales were incidental. But within a decade of his report reaching London, English and Dutch whaling fleets would descend on the waters he described, and the Spitzbergen whale fishery would become one of the most lucrative maritime enterprises in the world. Hudson had stumbled upon a fortune and walked past it because his eyes were fixed on a passage that did not exist. By late June, the Hopewell had reached the archipelago now known as Svalbard, deep inside the Arctic Circle, at a latitude of approximately 80 degrees north, farther north than any documented European voyage had ever penetrated. Hudson was sailing through a landscape of ice and stone that seemed to belong to a different planet. Towering glaciers calved into the sea with sounds like cannon fire. The light was constant and disorienting, a perpetual pale brilliance that erased the distinction between day and night and played tricks on the perception of distance. Icebergs drifted past in shapes that defied imagination, some of them larger than the ship by a factor of 100, their submerged mass visible as dark shadows in the translucent water below, and ahead, in every direction that mattered, ice. Not the scattered flows that could be navigated with patience and skill, but a solid, unbroken wall of pack ice stretching from horizon to horizon, compacted by centuries of pressure into a barrier as absolute as any mountain range. Hudson probed and searched and pushed the Hopewell into leads and gaps that closed behind them with terrifying speed. The ice groaned and shifted constantly, a living thing that could crush a wooden hull the way a hand crumples paper. There was no passage. The polar sea theory, the open water at the top of the world, was a beautiful fantasy contradicted by 1,000,000 square miles of frozen reality. Hudson turned south. The Hopewell limped back to England, arriving in September of 1607. By the standards of the age, this was not a failure. Hudson had reached 80 degrees north. He had charted coastlines no English captain had previously mapped. He had discovered the whaling grounds that would generate fortunes for decades. And he had provided definitive evidence that the direct polar route was impassable, information of real geographic value. The Muscovy Company should have been satisfied, but Hudson had not found a passage, and a passage was what the company wanted. Geographical data and whale sightings did not open a trade route to Asia. The company agreed to fund a second attempt, but the confidence behind their investment had begun to thin, like ice at the edge of a warming sea. The 1608 voyage followed a different theory but chased the same ghost. Instead of sailing over the pole, Hudson would try the Northeast Passage, the route along the northern coast of Russia, above the landmass of Scandinavia and Siberia, where the continent's edge might offer a navigable channel between land and ice. Previous English and Dutch expeditions had attempted this route and been defeated by ice in the vicinity of Novaya Zemlya, the bleak archipelago that hung like a frozen curtain between the Barents Sea and the Kara Sea. If a ship could get past Novaya Zemlya, the reasoning went. The coast beyond might trend southward toward warmer waters and an open passage to the Pacific. Hudson departed from London on April 22, 1608, again aboard the Hopewell. With a crew of roughly 14 men, his son John was aboard once more, and so was a man named Robert Juet, serving as first mate. Juet was an experienced navigator in his own right and were older than Hudson by most accounts, and possessed of the particular kind of competence that makes a man simultaneously invaluable and dangerous. He kept a meticulous journal. He knew his craft. And from the earliest entries in his log, there is a tone of barely suppressed criticism. The observations of a man who believed he could command the voyage better than the captain assigned to it. Juet would sail with Hudson twice more, his resentment compounding with each voyage like interest on a debt, until it finally came due on a June morning in James Bay. The Hopewell pushed northeast through increasingly hostile waters. By June, they were approaching Novaya Zemlya, and the ice was closing in. Hudson searched for a gap, a lead through the pack that might allow passage into the Kara Sea beyond. He found none. The ice was a fortress, seamless and indifferent to his ambition. What happened next is telling. Rather than turn for home immediately, Hudson proposed to his crew that they abandon the Northeast Passage entirely and sail west or across the Atlantic to North America, where rumors and fragmentary reports suggested another possible route to Asia might exist. It was a radical departure from his instructions. The Muscovy Company had funded a Northeast expedition. Sailing west would be a direct violation of his mandate. The crew refused. The details of this confrontation are sparse in the surviving records, but its significance is enormous. This was not the last time Hudson would attempt to redirect a voyage based on his own instinct against the explicit wishes of his crew and his financial backers. The pattern, brilliant intuition overriding institutional authority, a captain who trusted his own reading of the evidence more than his obligations to the men funding and manning his ships, was already established. On this occasion, the crew's resistance prevailed. Hudson turned for home. He arrived back in England in August 1608 with nothing to show for the voyage but more negative data. The Northeast Passage above Novaya Zemlya was blocked. The polar route was blocked. 2 voyages, 2 walls of ice, and a captain who, in the view of the men who wrote the checks, had failed to deliver a return on their investment. The Muscovy Company declined to fund a third expedition. For a man of Hudson's temperament, a man who could see the next horizon with almost prophetic clarity, this rejection must have been devastating. The passage existed. He was certain of it. Not above Russia, perhaps, and not over the pole, but somewhere in the vast, uncharted geography of the North. A route connected the Atlantic to the Pacific. Every voyage had brought him closer to understanding where it must lie. He needed one more expedition. He needed one more ship. And if England would not provide one, he would find someone who would. The Dutch East India Company, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the VOC, was the most powerful commercial enterprise on Earth. Founded in 1602, it held a Dutch monopoly on trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Strait of Magellan. It could raise armies, negotiate treaties, establish colonies, and mint its own coins. It was in practical terms a nation dressed in the clothing of a corporation. And it had the same problem England had. The routes to Asia's wealth were long, dangerous, and controlled by competitors. A northern passage would transform the VOC's strategic position overnight. Hudson traveled to the Netherlands. The details of how he secured his meeting with the VOC's directors are lost, but the outcome was recorded. In early 1609, the VOC contracted Henry Hudson to attempt the Northeast Passage one more time. The same route that had defeated him the previous year, past the same islands, through the same ice. The Dutch were either more optimistic than the English or less informed about the specifics of Hudson's previous failures. Either way, they gave him a ship. The Half Moon, the Halve Maan, was a Dutch vessel of approximately 80 tons, crewed by a mixed company of Dutch and English sailors. This detail would prove significant. A mixed crew meant divided loyalties, competing languages, different maritime traditions, and, critically, different thresholds for obedience. The Dutch sailors answered to the VOC. The English sailors answered to Hudson. When the two imperatives conflicted, the result would be chaos. The Half Moon sailed from Amsterdam on April 4, 1609, and headed northeast as instructed. By May, they had reached the Norwegian coast and turned toward the Barents Sea and the familiar barrier of Novaya Zemlya. The cold was savage. Ice formed on the rigging. The Dutch sailors, many of whom had spent their careers in the comparatively temperate waters of Southeast Asia, suffered intensely. The English sailors, who had some experience of northern waters, fared slightly better but took no pleasure in their advantage. And then Hudson made the decision that would change the history of two continents. He had been in correspondence with Captain John Smith, the same John Smith of Jamestown fame, who had written to him about reports from the Virginia colony suggesting that a river or strait somewhere along the mid-Atlantic coast of North America might provide a passage to the Pacific. The evidence was thin. It was based on indigenous accounts relayed through multiple translations and filtered through the optimistic lens of men who desperately wanted a passage to exist. But for Hudson, already facing a wall of ice he had encountered twice before and a crew on the edge of open revolt, Smith's letter offered something irresistible, a reason to turn west. He did not consult the VOC. He did not seek consensus among his officers. He simply changed course. The Half Moon swung its bow from northeast to west and began the long crossing of the Atlantic. The Dutch sailors aboard, men who had signed on for a northern expedition and now found themselves heading toward an entirely different continent under the command of a foreign captain, had every right to feel betrayed. But Hudson had the English portion of the crew behind him, and the ship sailed west. It was an act of extraordinary audacity. It was also an act of extraordinary arrogance. Hudson was operating a Dutch ship funded by Dutch money under Dutch orders, and he was unilaterally redirecting the entire enterprise based on his own reading of fragmentary intelligence from a competitor's colony. The decision reveals more about Hudson's character than any other single action in his career. He trusted his own judgment above all institutional authority. He believed, with the unshakable conviction of a man who had spent years studying the problem, that the passage lay to the west, and he would not allow the bureaucratic niceties of his employment contract to prevent him from finding it. This was the quality that made Hudson a great explorer. It was also the quality that would kill him. The Half Moon crossed the Atlantic and made landfall on the coast of North America in July 1609. Hudson sailed south first, probing the coastline as far as the Chesapeake Bay, then turned north, examining every inlet, every river mouth, every promising indentation in the coast. The crew made contact with indigenous peoples along the shore, encounters that ranged from cautious trade to outright violence. Jewett's journal from this period records a chilling casualness about the use of force against native populations, a reminder that the age of exploration was, for those being explored, an age of invasion. In early September, the Half Moon entered a harbor of surpassing beauty. The water was deep and calm, sheltered by wooded hills that rose on either side. The air carried the scent of pine and salt. Native canoes approached with offerings of tobacco and dried fruit. The harbor opened into a broad, majestic river that flowed from the north with a steady current suggesting great depth and extraordinary length. Hudson had found the river that would bear his name. He sailed north, the half-moon riding the current past landscapes of staggering beauty, the towering cliffs that would one day be called the Palisades, the wide stretches where the river broadened into something almost lake-like, the narrowing channels where green hills pressed close on either side and the water deepened to a dark, inscrutable blue. For days they pushed upriver, sounding the depth, charting the banks, trading with the indigenous communities they encountered along the way. The Mohican and Lenape peoples who lived along the river's banks watched this strange vessel with its billowing sails pass through their homeland, some approaching in friendship, others watching from a cautious distance. Hudson sailed approximately 150 miles upriver to the vicinity of what is now Albany, and there the river betrayed him. The water grew shallow. The current freshened. The tidal influence that had characterized the lower river disappeared. This was not a strait. This was not a passage to the Pacific. This was a river, a magnificent, navigable, commercially invaluable river, but a river nonetheless with a beginning and an end, flowing from mountains to the sea as rivers do. It went nowhere that Hudson needed to go. He turned the Half Moon around and sailed back to the sea. The return voyage to Europe carried consequences that Hudson could not have anticipated. When the Half Moon put in at Dartmouth, England in November 1609, English authorities seized the ship and detained Hudson. An English subject had sailed for a foreign power, explored territory that England claimed, and gathered intelligence of obvious strategic value. Hudson was effectively placed under house arrest. The ship was impounded. The Dutch never recovered the Half Moon. Hudson's charts, logs, and navigational data were confiscated, but the information could not be contained. Word of what Hudson had found, the magnificent harbor, the deep river, the fur-rich territories along its banks, reached Amsterdam through the Dutch sailors who had been aboard. Within months, Dutch merchants were organizing trading voyages to the region Hudson had described. Within a year, the first Dutch trading posts were being established along the river. Within 2 decades, the settlement of New Amsterdam would rise on the island at the river's mouth, the settlement that would eventually become the most important city in the Western Hemisphere. Henry Hudson had discovered the foundation of New York, and for this achievement, he was placed under arrest by his own country. The paradox of Hudson's position in the autumn of 1609 was absolute. He was simultaneously the most valuable navigator in Europe, and a man no one quite trusted. England resented his service to a foreign competitor. The Dutch resented his unilateral deviation from their instructions. His crews feared his unpredictability. His financial backers doubted his ability to follow orders. He had found a harbor and a river of immense strategic importance, and instead of reward, he received confinement. But the geography he had revealed was too valuable to ignore, and the knowledge locked inside his mind was too precious to waste on punishment. England wanted the Northwest Passage, the route west through the Arctic waters above North America that Hudson now believed existed with a conviction bordering on religious certainty. If such a passage could be found, it would be England's route, not Holland's, to the riches of Asia. And Hudson was the only man alive with the Arctic experience, the navigational skill, and the obsessive determination to find it. The charges were quietly dropped. A new expedition was organized with remarkable speed. 3 wealthy men, Sir Thomas Smythe, Sir Dudley Digges, and John Wolstenholme, all veterans of colonial investment, provided the funding. A ship was selected, the Discovery, a vessel of perhaps 55 tons, smaller than the Half Moon, with a crew of 23 men. Robert Jouet was aboard once more as first mate, his journal and his grievances both packed for the voyage. Hudson's son John was aboard as well, his presence a constant reminder that Hudson treated exploration as a family enterprise, bringing his boy into waters that had defeated grown men. And there was a newcomer, Henry Green, a young man of no maritime experience but considerable charm, whom Hudson had befriended in London and brought aboard over the strenuous objections of his officers. Green was, by the accounts that survive, Exactly the sort of man who attaches himself to powerful figures for personal advantage. Charismatic, unreliable, and gifted at telling people what they wanted to hear. Hudson installed Green in a position of informal privilege aboard the Discovery, sharing his cabin and his confidence, while experienced officers like Jouet watched and seethed. The crew of the Discovery was, from its first day at sea, a vessel carrying the instruments of its own destruction. They sailed from London on April 17, 1610, and turned the ship's bow toward the west. The Discovery crossed the Atlantic on a northwesterly course, passing south of Iceland and picking up the cold Labrador Current as it pushed toward the coastline of the New World. By late May, they had raised the coast of what is now eastern Canada, a jagged, inhospitable shoreline of dark rock and stunted forest, lashed by winds that carried the mineral bite of glacial ice even in early summer. Hudson turned north, following the coast toward the entrance of the strait that previous explorers had reported but never fully navigated, the narrow, treacherous channel separating the northern tip of Labrador from the southern coast of Baffin Island, where the Atlantic poured westward into unknown waters with a violence that suggested something enormous lay beyond. The strait was a gauntlet. Roughly 450 miles long, it compressed the tidal forces of two vast bodies of water into a channel that in places narrowed to less than 100 miles across. Ice choked its length. The currents were ferocious, unpredictable, capable of seizing a ship and carrying it miles off course in a matter of hours. Fog descended without warning, reducing visibility to the length of the bowsprit, and icebergs drifted through the murk like silent executioners, any one of them capable of ending the voyage with a single collision. The tides ran at speeds that no sailing vessel could fight, and the magnetic compass, already unreliable at high latitudes, behaved erratically in the proximity of so much iron-bearing rock, its needle swinging in lazy arcs that mocked the very concept of direction. Hudson drove the Discovery into this passage in June 1610, and for the next several weeks the ship fought its way westward through conditions that tested every skill its captain possessed. The ice closed around them repeatedly, forcing Hudson to search for leads, channels of open water between flows that might or might not connect to further open water ahead. Reading ice from the deck of a small ship was an art that combined observation, intuition, and a willingness to commit to a course of action based on incomplete information. Hudson excelled at it. He could look at the color of the sky above the horizon and tell whether the water ahead was open or frozen. A pale, greenish-white reflection indicated ice, while a darker tone suggested navigable sea. He could read the behavior of birds and marine mammals for clues about the location of open water. He could feel changes in the ship's motion that told him the current had shifted beneath the hull. But skill was not enough to prevent fear from taking hold among the crew. The men of the Discovery had signed on for an expedition, not a siege. Each day in the strait brought new encounters with ice that groaned and shifted around them, new moments when the hull shuddered against underwater obstructions, new hours spent in fog so thick that men standing at the bow could not see the stern. The cold was relentless, the food was deteriorating, and the officers, Jouet chief among them, were beginning to question whether Hudson had any clear plan beyond pushing forward and hoping the ice would relent. The first serious confrontation erupted in late June. Jouet, whose journal entries had grown increasingly caustic since the voyage began, openly challenged Hudson's decision to continue west through the strait. The specific details of the argument were not recorded with precision, but its substance was clear. Jouet believed the expedition was heading into a trap. The ice ahead was thickening, not thinning. The season was advancing. Every mile west made the return voyage longer and more dangerous. A prudent captain would turn back, report his findings, and let a better-equipped expedition attempt the passage in a subsequent year. Hudson did not turn back. He could not turn back. The western end of the strait was pulling at him with a gravitational force that no argument about provisions or ice conditions could counteract. Beyond the strait lay the unknown. And the unknown for Hudson was not a source of fear, but of compulsion. He had sailed farther north than any recorded European. He had navigated a great river into the heart of a continent. He had spent his entire career approaching barriers and pushing through them, and the barrier of ice in the strait was simply the latest in a series that his experience told him could be overcome with sufficient nerve and patience. He demoted Jewett. The first mate, the experienced navigator, the meticulous journalist, the man whose competence had made him indispensable on 3 previous voyages, was stripped of his position and replaced by Robert Bylot, a younger, less experienced officer whose primary qualification appeared to be that he did not openly challenge his captain's decisions. It was a catastrophic misjudgment. Jewett did not leave the ship. He remained aboard, humiliated and enraged, his influence among the crew undiminished by his change in title. If anything, the demotion increased his authority among the discontented sailors. Here was proof, visible and undeniable, that Hudson punished competence and rewarded loyalty, that speaking the truth on this ship was more dangerous than speaking lies. The Discovery emerged from the western end of the strait in early August 1610, and what Hudson saw must have made his heart surge with the certainty that he had been right all along. Before him stretched an ocean, water extended to the horizon in every direction, west, south, northwest, a vast, apparently limitless expanse that bore no resemblance to the confined, ice-choked channels he had been navigating for weeks. The color of the water was deep and dark, suggesting enormous depth. The currents ran strong, as if fed by distant sources. The sheer scale of what lay before him was staggering. This was not a bay. This was not an inlet. This was a body of water large enough to be a sea, and if it was a sea, it might connect to the Pacific. The Northwest Passage, the prize that had eluded European navigators for a century, might be waiting just beyond the next headland, the next island, the next stretch of open water. What Hudson had found was in fact the body of water that would bear his name, Hudson Bay. It was enormous, roughly the size of the Mediterranean Sea, large enough to contain the entire British Isles several times over. But it was not connected to the Pacific. It was an inland sea, vast and shallow, fed by dozens of rivers draining the Canadian interior, locked in ice for 8 months of the year, and bounded on every side by some of the most unforgiving terrain on the North American continent. It was, in short, a dead end of continental proportions, a geographic trap so convincing in its apparent promise that it would lure expeditions into its depths for another 2 centuries before the truth was finally accepted. Hudson did not know this. He could not have known it. The bay was too large to comprehend from a single vantage point, and his charts, which were effectively blank pages marked with speculation overtures, offered no guidance. What he did was what his instinct demanded. He sailed south, following the eastern coast of the bay, searching for the outlet that would carry him west toward Asia. Through August and into September, the Discovery traced the shoreline of what is now eastern Hudson Bay, pushing south through waters that grew progressively shallower and more treacherous. The bottom was a maze of shoals and submerged rock formations that threatened the hull with every mile. The weather deteriorated as autumn advanced. Temperatures plummeted. The first new ice began to form on the surface of the water, thin and fragile at first, easily broken by the ship's bow, but growing thicker and more persistent with each passing day. The message was unmistakable to anyone willing to read it. Winter was approaching, and winter in Hudson Bay was not a season to be endured aboard an open ship. The crew understood this. They had been at sea for 5 months. Their provisions were diminishing. The cold was becoming dangerous, and they were sailing deeper into an enclosed body of water with no clear exit and no guarantee that the ice forming around them would not seal the ship in place for the duration of the winter. The men wanted to turn north, retrace their route through the strait, and make for home before the ice closed the passage entirely. It was the rational calculation, the decision that any responsible commander would weigh against the possible reward of continued exploration. Hudson pushed south. By late October, the Discovery had entered the shallow, constricted waters at the extreme southern end of Hudson Bay, the body of water now known as James Bay. And there, in early November 1610, the ice closed around them. It did not happen suddenly. The freezing of a large body of water is a gradual process, almost gentle in its early stages. First, a thin film of ice forms on the surface during the coldest hours of the night, so fragile that a thrown stone shatters it. Then the film thickens, surviving into the morning hours, resisting the weakening sun. The individual sheets begin to join, their edges overlapping and freezing together into larger plates. The plates grow, merge, compound. Within days, the water near the shore is covered by a continuous sheet of ice that creaks and flexes with the movement of the current below but no longer breaks. Then the ice reaches the ship. It touches the hull, gently at first, almost tentatively, and then it grips. The Discovery was frozen in place. The ice locked around the hull like a fist closing around a walnut, and there it would remain for the next 8 months. 23 men, a single small ship, and a quantity of provisions that was already insufficient for the winter that now trapped them. The nearest European settlement was hundreds of miles to the southeast, the struggling outposts of the English colonies along the Atlantic coast. Between the Discovery and those settlements lay an unbroken wilderness of boreal forest, frozen rivers, and territory inhabited by indigenous peoples who owed nothing to the strangers in their midst. There would be no rescue. There would be no resupply. Whatever the men of the Discovery had aboard was all they would have until the ice released them in the spring, if it released them at all. The psychology of an Arctic winter aboard a trapped ship follows a pattern so consistent that later polar expeditions would study it as a recognized phenomenon. The initial phase is characterized by activity and denial. The men set about making the ship habitable for winter, constructing shelters on the ice, hunting whatever game presented itself, establishing routines of work and watch that impose structure on the shapeless days. There is purpose in this phase, and purpose sustains morale. The second phase arrives with the deep cold. In James Bay, winter temperatures routinely drop below -30 degrees Fahrenheit. At these temperatures, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Metal becomes dangerous to touch. A bare hand placed against an iron fitting will stick. The moisture in the skin freezing instantly to the surface, and pulling away means leaving skin behind. Breath freezes in the air and falls as ice crystals. The inside of the ship heated by whatever means available. Small fires, body warmth, the combustion of diminishing fuel, becomes a cave of condensation and reek, the moisture from 23 bodies freezing on every cold surface, coating the beams and planking in a layer of frost that thaws during the warmest hours and drips on the men below. The men began to suffer. Scurvy, the great killer of long voyages, crept through the crew with its terrible progression. It begins with fatigue and a sense of unease, a weariness that sleep does not cure. Then the gums swell and bleed. Old wounds reopen. Bruises appear from the slightest contact and refuse to heal. The joints ache, then swell, then become so painful that movement is agony. In its advanced stages, the teeth loosen and fall out, the bones become brittle, and the sufferer becomes too weak to rise from where he lies. The cure? Fresh fruit and vegetables, sources of vitamin C, was not understood in 1610, though experienced sailors had observed that fresh food seemed to alleviate the symptoms. In the frozen wasteland of James Bay in midwinter, fresh food was a fantasy. The crew hunted when they could. Ptarmigan, the white-feathered birds that inhabit the northern forests, provided some sustenance, as did whatever fish could be caught through holes chopped in the ice. But game was scarce in the depths of winter, and the men were burning more calories in the cold than they could replace. The ship's stores, salt pork, hardtack, beer, cheese, dwindled at a rate that made every meal a calculation, and every portion a potential grievance. It was in this environment of cold, hunger, sickness, and confinement, that Hudson's leadership began to disintegrate. The accounts that survive are filtered through the perspectives of men who would later need to justify mutiny, and they must be read with that caveat firmly in mind. But the pattern they describe is consistent enough across multiple sources to suggest a core of truth. Hudson became erratic. He redistributed food in ways that appeared arbitrary, favoring some men and shortchanging others. Henry Green, the young gentleman with no maritime experience whom Hudson had brought aboard over his officers' objections, continued to receive preferential treatment, better food, warmer quarters, access to the captain's cabin, while experienced sailors went hungry and cold. Hudson quarreled with his officers over matters both significant and trivial. He accused men of hoarding food. He made and reversed decisions with bewildering speed, issuing orders in the morning that he countermanded by afternoon. Most damaging of all, he refused to share information. A captain on a trapped ship has one irreducible obligation to his crew: transparency about their situation, how much food remains, how long it must last, what the plan is for spring. Hudson either could not or would not provide these answers. When pressed, he deflected or grew angry. The men were left to speculate, and speculation in the dark hold of a frozen ship among sick and hungry men breeds monsters faster than the Arctic breeds ice. The winter stretched on. December, January, February, the darkest months when the sun barely cleared the horizon and the cold reached its most extreme intensity. Men who had been healthy in the autumn were now gaunt, their skin yellowed, their movements slow and painful. The ship groaned constantly as the ice expanded and contracted around it, the sounds of compression traveling through the hull like the grinding of enormous teeth. Sleep was fitful. The air below decks was foul. Arguments erupted over nothing and escalated into confrontations that required physical separation. And through it all, Hudson maintained his conviction that the voyage would succeed. Spring would come. The ice would release the ship. He would find the passage, the outlet from this enormous bay that must connect to the Pacific. The suffering of the winter was temporary. The discovery that awaited them was permanent. He could see it with the absolute clarity of a man who had spent his life reading water and ice and horizon, and the fact that his crew could not see it, that they saw only hunger and cold and a captain losing his grip, was, to Hudson, evidence of their limitation, not his. Spring arrived with excruciating slowness. March brought marginally longer days, but no warmth. April brought the first tentative thaws, ice softening along the shoreline, meltwater pooling on the surface of the frozen bay, a quality of light that hinted at change without delivering it. The crew dragged themselves through the routines of preparation, readying the ship for the moment when the ice would loosen enough to allow movement. Some of the sick had recovered partially. Others had not recovered at all. At least one man, the ship's gunner, John Williams, had died during the winter, though the exact date and circumstances of his death were poorly recorded. By June, the ice was finally breaking up. Vast sheets of it separated from the main pack and drifted free, the open water expanding daily as the sun climbed higher and the temperatures rose above freezing for the first time in 8 months. The Discovery stirred in its prison of ice. The hull creaked as the pressure around it eased. Water appeared along the sides of the ship, dark, cold, but liquid, the promise of movement, of escape, of a return to the open sea where wind and skill could carry them away from this desolate place. Hudson gave his orders. They would not sail for home, for they would continue the exploration. The reaction among the crew can be imagined even where it was not recorded. These men had survived 8 months of frozen imprisonment. They were sick. They were starving. Several of them could barely stand. The ship's provisions were nearly exhausted, and their captain, the man who had led them into this trap, who had refused to turn back when turning back was still possible, who had spent the winter quarreling with his officers and favoring his young companion while experienced sailors suffered. Their captain proposed to sail deeper into the unknown rather than toward home. It was at this point that Hudson made a decision so baffling that historians have debated its meaning for 4 centuries. He took the remaining food stores, whatever was left of the ship's provisions, and redistributed them personally, locking much of the supply in his own cabin and controlling its distribution directly. The effect was to place the crew's survival literally in his hands, dependent on his daily judgment about who would eat and how much. Whether this was an attempt to impose discipline, a symptom of paranoia, or a calculated move to maintain control over men he no longer trusted, the result was identical. It confirmed every fear the crew harbored about their captain's fitness to command. The mutiny that followed was not impulsive. It was organized over several days by a core group of conspirators who had been discussing the possibility since late in the winter. The leaders were Henry Green, the same Henry Green whom Hudson had favored, fed, and defended against the criticism of his officers, and Robert Jouet, the demoted first mate whose grievances had been compounding since the second voyage. They were joined by the boatswain, William Wilson, and several other sailors whose names appear in the testimonies that were later given in London. Abakuk Prickett, the representative of the voyage's investors, would claim that he argued against the mutiny but was overruled. His account is detailed, articulate, and precisely calibrated to absolve himself of responsibility. Which is to say, it reads like the testimony of a man who knew exactly which way events were moving and positioned himself on the surviving side. The conspirators waited until the early hours of June 22nd, when the ship was free enough of ice to sail. They waited for the cover of the subarctic dawn, when the light was sufficient to work, but the hour was early enough that Hudson and his loyalists would be in their bunks. They moved with the coordination of men who had rehearsed their roles. And so we arrive back at the morning where this story began. Hudson dragged from his cabin in his nightclothes, his hands bound, his son brought up from below. The sick men, those too weak or too loyal to be useful to the mutineers, forced from the ship along with them. Philip Staff, the ship's carpenter, was not targeted by the conspirators. He was healthy, skilled, and his abilities would be needed for the return voyage. But Staff looked at what was being done and made a choice that stands as one of the few moments of uncomplicated moral courage in this entire sordid episode. He demanded to be put into the shallop with Hudson. He would not remain aboard a ship commanded by men who would do this to their captain. The mutineers obliged him. They did not care about Staff's moral convictions. They cared about getting Hudson off the ship and themselves pointed toward home before the ice could trap them for another winter. 9 men in the shallop. The tow line cut. The Discovery sailing away under a wind that neither paused nor cared. And then silence. The vast absorptive silence of James Bay closing over Henry Hudson and his companions like water closing over a stone. The mutineers turned the ship north. Robert Bylotke, who had replaced Jouet as first mate and whose role in the mutiny remains ambiguous, took effective command of the navigation. The Discovery retraced its route through the southern reaches of Hudson Bay, heading for the strait that would carry them east toward the Atlantic and home. But the bay was not finished with them. The same geography that had trapped Hudson now conspired against the men who had cast him out. Ice still choked much of the route northward. Food was critically low. And on the shores of the bay, as they paused to hunt and forage for provisions, they encountered a group of Inuit people who initially engaged in cautious trade. The encounter turned violent. The details vary depending on which surviving account one trusts, but the outcome was unambiguous. Henry Green and William Wilson, 2 of the mutiny's principal architects, were killed in the fighting. Several other crew members were wounded. The ship fled the encounter with even fewer provisions than before and a crew now diminished by death and injury. Robert Jouet, the embittered navigator whose resentment had helped fuel the mutiny, did not survive the voyage home. He died somewhere in the waters east of Hudson Bay, of starvation most likely, compounded by scurvy and exhaustion. The man who had kept such meticulous records of his grievances against Hudson became another body committed to the waters that Hudson had charted. There is an irony in this that even the most restrained narrator cannot entirely overlook. The Discovery limped into the Atlantic. Violet navigated with a skeleton crew of men too weak and sick to properly handle the ship's rigging. They encountered fishing vessels off the coast of Ireland and begged for food. They eventually reached London in September 1611, carrying a ship that belonged to dead and absent men, charts drawn by the captain they had abandoned, and a story that would require extremely careful telling if any of them hoped to avoid the gallows. Abacook Prickett told the story. He told it to the Admiralty. He told it to the investors. He told it with the careful precision of a man who understood that the narrative of the mutiny was now more important than the mutiny itself. In his telling, Hudson was erratic, dangerous, and determined to lead the entire crew to their deaths. The mutiny was an act of desperate self-preservation by men who had no other option. Prickett himself had argued against it. He had been restrained, he said, prevented from intervening. He was a loyal man trapped among desperate ones, a witness to events he could not control. The authorities listened. They weighed the testimony. They considered the charges. And then they performed the calculation that would define Hudson's legacy more completely than any geographic discovery. The men aboard the Discovery had sailed through Hudson Strait, into Hudson Bay, and back. They carried in their memories the location of the strait's entrance, the currents and ice patterns within it, the depth and extent of the bay, the position of islands and coastlines that appeared on no existing chart. This knowledge was of enormous strategic value to a nation competing with France, Spain, and the Netherlands for control of the North American interior. Punishing these men meant losing that knowledge. Freeing them meant gaining it. England chose knowledge over justice. The mutineers were never convicted. Several of them sailed north again within years, guiding new expeditions through the waters that Hudson had discovered at the cost of his life. The bay became English territory. The strait became a highway. The geographic framework that Hudson had assembled at the price of 4 voyages, escalating mutinies, and his own annihilation became the foundation upon which England built its claim to northern North America. Henry Hudson vanished into the landscape he had spent his life mapping, and the men who sent him there were rewarded for bringing the maps home. The silence that followed Hudson's disappearance was not merely physical, it was institutional, deliberate, and complete. No search expedition was mounted, no ship was dispatched to James Bay to look for survivors. No official inquiry pressed the question of whether 9 men cast adrift in an open boat in subarctic waters might, conceivably, still be alive. The possibility was not investigated because investigating it served no one's interest. The investors wanted their navigational data. The Admiralty wanted their strategic advantage. The surviving crew wanted their freedom. And the dead, or the presumably dead, wanted nothing at all. Because the dead have no advocates in a world that measures value in charts and trade routes. This institutional silence is worth pausing over because it reveals something essential about the machinery that produced men like Hudson and then consumed them. The age of exploration operated on a transactional logic so ruthless that it makes modern corporate culture look sentimental by comparison. A navigator was an instrument. His value lay in what he could discover, map, and report. Once the discovery was made, the map drawn, and the report delivered, the instrument's utility was exhausted. Hudson had served his function. The data had been extracted. The container could be discarded, but the data itself, the geographic intelligence that the surviving crew carried back to London, proved to be one of the most consequential bodies of navigational knowledge assembled in the 17th century. And to understand what grew from Hudson's discoveries, we need to follow the branching consequences of his 4 voyages as they rippled outward across the next several centuries, reshaping the political geography of 2 continents and creating commercial empires that would outlast the nations that founded them. The river came first. Hudson's exploration of the river that bears his name in September 1609 had been, from his own perspective, a failure. The river did not connect to the Pacific. It was not a passage. It was a dead end dressed in autumn foliage. But from the perspective of the Dutch merchants who received reports from the returning crew of the Half Moon, the river was something far more valuable than a passage. It was an artery. The Hudson River penetrated deep into the North American interior. flowing from the Adirondack Mountains through a valley of extraordinary fertility, past forests dense with beaver, otter, mink, and other fur-bearing animals whose pelts commanded enormous prices in European markets. The indigenous peoples who lived along its banks, the Mohican, the Lenape, the Mohawk, and other nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, had been trading furs among themselves for centuries and possessed sophisticated networks of exchange that could be redirected with the right combination of trade goods and diplomacy toward European buyers. The river was navigable by ocean-going vessels for roughly 150 miles and by smaller craft considerably farther. It offered sheltered anchorage, fresh water, timber for shipbuilding, and access to an interior so vast that its resources seemed, to European eyes accustomed to the depleted landscapes of their own continent, essentially infinite. Dutch traders arrived within a year of Hudson's report reaching Amsterdam. By 1614, the New Netherland Company had been chartered to exploit the region's commercial potential. By 1621, the Dutch West India Company, the WIC, the Atlantic counterpart to the VOC that had originally employed Hudson, assumed control of the territory and began the systematic colonization of the Hudson River Valley. Trading posts were established at Fort Orange near the head of navigation where Hudson had turned back, and at the southern tip of the island called Mannahatta by its indigenous inhabitants, where the river emptied into one of the finest natural harbors on Earth. The settlement on Mannahatta became New Amsterdam. Its location was dictated entirely by the geography that Hudson had charted: the deep harbor, the sheltered anchorage, the river access to the interior, would give its name to a street, would give its name to a street, the street would give its name to a financial district, the financial district would become the beating heart of global capitalism, all of it traceable, in an unbroken chain of cause and consequence, to an English navigator sailing a Dutch ship up a river in September 1609, looking for something that was not there. New Amsterdam became New York in 1664, when an English fleet sailed into the harbor and the Dutch governor, Peter Stuyvesant, surrendered without a fight. The transfer was almost casual, a negotiation between European powers trading colonial assets like playing cards, but the city that changed hands that day was already positioned, by virtue of its geography, to become the dominant port on the Atlantic seaboard. The harbor could accommodate the largest vessels afloat. The river connected the coast to the interior. The location was central to the emerging colonial economy, equidistant from the fishing grounds of New England and the tobacco plantations of Virginia. Everything that would make New York the most important city in the Western Hemisphere was implicit in the geography that Hudson mapped. He had handed a nation its future capital, and the nation had not yet been born. The fur trade that flowed down the Hudson River transformed not only European commerce but indigenous societies in ways that were catastrophic and irreversible. The Mohican, who controlled the lower river valley, and the Mohawk, who controlled access to the interior from the west, found themselves positioned as intermediaries in a trade that offered unprecedented access to European manufactured goods, iron tools, woven cloth, copper kettles, and most consequentially, firearms. The competition for control of this trade intensified existing rivalries and created new ones. The Beaver Wars of the mid-17th century, a series of devastating conflicts among indigenous nations fighting for control of fur-trapping territories, were fueled by European demand for pelts and European supply of weapons. Entire nations were displaced, destroyed, or absorbed. The Huron Confederacy, one of the most sophisticated political organizations in North America, was shattered. The Haudenosaunee expanded their territory through military campaigns that reached from the Great Lakes to the Carolinas. The ecological landscape was transformed as beaver populations were hunted to near extinction across vast swaths of the continent, altering waterways and ecosystems that had been shaped by beaver activity for millennia. None of this was Hudson's intention. He had been looking for a passage to China. But the consequences of what he found instead were more far-reaching than any passage could have been. The river that disappointed him became the conduit through which European economic systems penetrated the North American interior. And the effects of that penetration, commercial, ecological, political, and human, are still unfolding. The bay was next, and its consequences were, if anything, even more profound. Hudson Bay. The enormous inland sea that Hudson had mistaken for a potential passage to the Pacific proved to be the geographic key to an entire continent. Its coastline stretched for thousands of miles, and the rivers that emptied into it drained an area larger than Western Europe. The Nelson River, the Churchill River, the Hayes River, the Albany River. These waterways reached deep into the heart of North America, connecting the bay to the Great Lakes, the prairies, and the boreal forests that covered the northern half of the continent like a green and silent ocean. For the indigenous peoples who lived along these rivers, the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Assiniboine, the Chippewayan, and dozens of other nations, the bay was not a discovery. It was the center of a world they had inhabited for thousands of years. But for European commercial interests, Hudson's revelation of the bay's existence and approximate geography opened a strategic possibility of extraordinary scope. If you could establish trading posts at the mouths of the rivers feeding into Hudson Bay, you could tap into the fur trade of the entire continental interior without the expense and difficulty of transporting goods overland from the Atlantic coast. Ships could sail directly from England into the bay through Hudson Strait, unload trade goods at coastal posts, and load furs brought down by indigenous traders who had acquired them from networks extending thousands of miles into the interior. It was a commercial shortcut of breathtaking elegance. And it bypassed the French, who controlled the St. Lawrence River and had built their own fur trading empire around the Great Lakes. The realization of this possibility took decades, delayed by the English Civil War, the uncertainties of Arctic navigation, and the sheer logistical challenge of establishing permanent settlements in one of the harshest environments on Earth. But in 1668, a small vessel called the Nonsuch sailed into Hudson Bay and established the first English trading post on its shores. The voyage was financed by Prince Rupert of the Rhine, cousin to King Charles II, and backed by a syndicate of English aristocrats and merchants who understood that the bay Hudson had found was not a geographic dead end but a commercial portal. On May 2, 1670, King Charles II granted a royal charter to the Governor and Company of Adventurers of England trading into Hudson's Bay. The charter was breathtaking in its scope. It granted the company, which came to be known simply as the Hudson's Bay Company, exclusive trading rights over the entire drainage basin of Hudson Bay. This territory, which the charter called Rupert's Land, encompassed approximately 1.5 million square miles. An area larger than the entire Indian subcontinent, stretching from the Labrador coast to the Rocky Mountains, and from the Arctic tundra to the headwaters of the Mississippi. The charter granted the company not merely trading rights, but governmental authority, the power to make laws, administer justice, raise armies, and conduct diplomacy with indigenous nations. It was in effect the creation of a private state within a state, an imperial franchise that made the modern concept of corporate power look modest by comparison. The Hudson's Bay Company became one of the most enduring commercial enterprises in human history. Its trading posts, York Factory, Churchill, Moose Factory, Fort Albany, became the nuclei around which the economy of northern Canada organized itself for the next 2 centuries. The fur trade that flowed through these posts shaped the political alliances, military conflicts, and economic relationships of indigenous nations across the continent. The company's rivalry with the Northwest Company, a competing enterprise based in Montreal, drove European exploration deeper into the interior, eventually reaching the Pacific coast and establishing the territorial framework that would become modern Canada. The company still exists. Founded in 1670, it operates today as a Canadian retail corporation, its department stores a peculiar monument to a commercial lineage that stretches back through centuries of fur trading, Arctic exploration, and imperial expansion to a single body of water discovered by a man who was looking for something else entirely. Henry Hudson's name graces the bay. The company that exploited the bay bears no trace of him. He provided the geography, others provided the profit. The strait, the treacherous passage between Labrador and Baffin Island through which Hudson had forced the discovery in the summer of 1610, became the gateway through which all subsequent exploration of the bay in the Canadian Arctic would pass. Hudson Strait was not merely a navigational challenge, it was the choke point of an entire geographic system. The narrow passage through which ships, goods, people, and imperial ambitions had to squeeze in order to reach the vast territories beyond. Mastering the strait's currents, ice patterns, and seasonal rhythms became a specialized body of knowledge passed down through generations of Arctic mariners, each of whom owed their foundational understanding of the passage to the observations Hudson and his crew had made during their harrowing transit. Robert Bylot, the navigator who had replaced Juet as first mate, whose role in the mutiny was never clearly established, and who had guided the Discovery home after Hudson's abandonment, returned to the strait multiple times in subsequent years. In 1615 and 1616, he sailed as navigator aboard expeditions commanded by William Baffin, exploring the waters north and west of the strait's entrance. These voyages, which charted much of what is now Baffin Bay and identified Lancaster Sound, the actual entrance to the Northwest Passage that would not be navigated for another 3 centuries, were only possible because Bylot carried in his memory the navigational knowledge that Hudson had accumulated. The mutineer became the vehicle through which the murdered captain's expertise was transmitted to the next generation of explorers. The knowledge survived the knower. Baffin and Bylot's voyages represented the immediate flowering of Hudson's geographic legacy, but the longer-term consequences extended far beyond the lifetimes of any of the men involved. The search for the Northwest Passage, the route through the Arctic waterways of northern Canada that would connect the Atlantic to the Pacific, became one of the defining obsessions of European exploration for the next 300 years. Expedition after expedition plunged into the maze of islands, straits, and frozen channels that lay beyond Hudson Strait, each one building on the knowledge accumulated by its predecessors, each one pushing slightly farther into the labyrinth before being turned back by ice, starvation, or death. The roll call of these expeditions reads like a catalog of human persistence and human suffering. Luke Fox and Thomas James explored Hudson Bay itself in 1631, searching for the western outlet that Hudson had believed existed. James's expedition, which endured a winter in the bay even more harrowing than Hudson's, produced a narrative of survival so vivid that it is believed to have influenced Samuel Taylor Coleridge's composition of The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Christopher Middleton searched the bay's western coast in 1741. Samuel Hearne traveled overland from the bay to the Arctic Ocean in 1771, proving that no navigable passage existed at the latitude of Hudson Bay. The passage, if it existed, lay farther north, in the frozen archipelago above the Canadian mainland, where the ice was thicker, the cold more extreme, and the margin for error effectively zero. John Franklin sailed into that archipelago in 1845 with 2 ships and 129 men. None of them returned. The search for Franklin's lost expedition consumed decades and dozens of rescue voyages, and it was during these searches that the Northwest Passage was finally mapped. Not by a single triumphant voyage, but by the accumulated observations of ships crisscrossing the Arctic in search of dead men. Roald Amundsen finally navigated the passage in 1906 in a voyage that took 3 years and required a vessel small enough to navigate the shallow, ice-choked channels that had defeated every larger ship. The passage existed. It had always existed, but it was commercially useless. Too shallow, too frozen, too dangerous for any practical trade route. The prize that had driven Hudson and all who followed him was real but worthless, a geographic fact without economic meaning. Until, that is, the ice began to melt. In the 21st century, climate change has begun to open the Northwest Passage in ways that would have seemed miraculous to Hudson and his contemporaries. Summer ice coverage in the Canadian Arctic has declined dramatically. Shipping routes that were impassable for 10 months of the year are now navigable for increasing periods. The commercial potential that drove Hudson north in 1607, the dream of a shorter route between Atlantic and Pacific markets, has begun to materialize, not through exploration, but through the warming of the planet itself. The passage that killed Hudson and Franklin and dozens of others is becoming slowly and with enormous geopolitical implications a reality. Russia, Canada, the United States, Denmark, and Norway are competing for control of Arctic shipping routes and the mineral resources beneath the melting ice. The strategic calculus that Hudson's backers performed in the early 17th century, that a northern passage would transform global trade, is being vindicated 4 centuries later under circumstances that none of them could have imagined. Hudson's geographic fingerprint, then, extends from the past into the future. The river became New York. The bay became the Hudson's Bay Company and the territorial foundation of Canada. The strait became the gateway to the Arctic. And the passage that Hudson spent his life pursuing is becoming navigable precisely as the frozen world he knew is disappearing. His legacy is written in the geography of a continent, and that geography is changing. But the geographic legacy, vast as it is, does not capture the full measure of what Hudson's story means. There is another legacy, and darker, more personal, and ultimately more instructive, that has to do with the nature of obsession itself and the particular way in which brilliant men destroy themselves by refusing to see the limits of their own vision. Hudson's 4 voyages trace an arc that is almost clinical in its progression. The first voyage was bold but rational, a well-funded expedition testing a legitimate geographic theory, conducted by a competent captain who turned back when the evidence demanded it. The second voyage repeated the pattern with diminishing returns. The same theory, the same ice, the same failure, but with the addition of Hudson's first attempt to redirect the voyage against his instructions. The third voyage abandoned all pretense of following orders. Hudson simply commandeered a Dutch ship and sailed it to a different continent, guided by his own interpretation of fragmentary evidence and his unshakable conviction that he understood the geography better than anyone else alive. The fourth voyage carried this pattern to its terminal conclusion. A captain so consumed by his certainty that he sailed past every warning, ignored every legitimate grievance, and drove his crew to the point where removing him from command seemed less dangerous than following him further into the ice. Each voyage pushed farther. Each voyage alienated more people. Each voyage discovered something of genuine and lasting value. And each voyage brought Hudson closer to the annihilation that his temperament made inevitable. The pattern is not unique to Hudson. It recurs throughout the history of exploration with the regularity of a natural law. The same qualities that enable great discovery, the willingness to risk everything on an intuition, the capacity to endure what others cannot, the refusal to accept limits that lesser minds consider absolute, are the qualities that, unchecked by self-awareness or institutional restraint, lead to catastrophe. What distinguished Hudson from other explorers who followed similar trajectories was the particular form of his blindness. He could read ice, water, wind, and coastline with an intuitive brilliance that his contemporaries recognized even as they feared its consequences. He could look at a body of water and understand its depth, its current, its connection to larger systems with an accuracy that bordered on the uncanny. But he could not read the men standing on his own deck. He could not see that Jouet's meticulous journal entries were evidence of a man cataloging grievances. He could not see that Green's charm was the charm of an opportunist who would abandon his patron the moment the patron's utility was exhausted. He could not see that redistributing the food supply was not an assertion of authority, but a declaration of war against men who were already starving. His blindness was not stupidity. It was the particular blindness of a man whose entire perceptual apparatus was calibrated for geography rather than humanity. Hudson understood landscapes. He did not understand people. He could navigate a strait that no European had ever entered and emerge on the other side with his ship intact. He could not navigate a conversation with a resentful first mate without making an enemy. The skills were not complementary. They were, in Hudson's case, mutually exclusive. The intensity of his geographic perception seeming to consume the cognitive resources that might otherwise have been devoted to reading the moods and motivations of the men around him. This is the central tragedy of Hudson's story, and it operates on a level that transcends the specific circumstances of a 17th century mutiny. It is the tragedy of a mind that could see farther than anyone else in one direction and was completely blind in another. The geographic vision that made Hudson irreplaceable was inseparable from the interpersonal blindness that made him impossible. You could not have one without the other. The same obsessive focus that allowed him to push past barriers that stopped other navigators was the focus that prevented him from noticing that his crew was planning to kill him. He was destroyed not despite his gifts, but because of them. Consumed by the very quality that made him extraordinary. The men who sailed home on his ship understood none of this. They understood only that they were alive and he was not, and that the charts they carried were worth more to England than the man who had drawn them. The Admiralty understood it no better. They performed their cost-benefit analysis, weighed a navigator's life against a navigator's data, and chose the data. It was not cruelty exactly. It was something worse. It was indifference, the institutional indifference of a system that valued outcomes over individuals and measured human worth in geographic coordinates. And so the records closed over Henry Hudson the way the ice closed over his shallop. The charts were copied and distributed. The strait, the bay, and the river received his name, a cartographic memorial that preserved the label while erasing the person. The mutineers dispersed into subsequent voyages and subsequent lives. Robert Bylot's name appears on maps of the Arctic. Abakuk Prickett's testimony was filed and archived. The investors received their returns. The company received its charter. Henry Hudson received nothing, not justice, not a grave, not even the dignity of a confirmed death. He exists in the historical record as a presence that became an absence, a man defined by the moment he ceased to be findable. His birth is unknown. His death is unknown. Between those two unknowns lies a life of extraordinary achievement and extraordinary failure, compressed into 4 voyages spanning just 4 years of recorded activity, producing geographic discoveries that reshaped the world and personal catastrophes that destroyed everyone they touched. There is one final detail that deserves attention before we turn to the question of what happened, or might have happened, in the shallop after the tow line was cut. It concerns the fate of John Hudson, the navigator's son, who accompanied his father on at least 3 of the 4 voyages and who was cast into the shallop alongside him on the morning of June 22, 1611. John Hudson was, by any reasonable measure, the most innocent casualty of this entire enterprise. He had not chosen to explore the Arctic. He had been brought there by his father, raised aboard ships in some of the most dangerous waters on Earth, educated in the arts of navigation and seamanship by a man who apparently saw no contradiction between loving his child and subjecting that child to mortal risk. John had committed no offense against the mutineers. He was not accused of hoarding food, playing favorites, or making irrational command decisions. He was placed in the shallop for the simple reason that he was his father's son, and the mutineers either feared his future vengeance or simply did not care enough about a teenager's life to separate him from the man they were condemning. The image of John Hudson, standing in an open boat, watching the ship that had been his home disappear into the gray distance, standing beside a father whose decisions had brought them both to this place, is perhaps the most haunting element of a story that does not lack for haunting elements. It speaks to something that the geographic legacy, the commercial consequences, and the navigational achievements cannot address. The human cost of obsession, paid not only by the obsessed, but by those who love them and cannot escape the gravity of their fixation. What happened to the 9 men in the shallop after the Discovery sailed away? Nobody knows. The honest answer is that no one ever will. But the question has generated 4 centuries of speculation, investigation, and myth, and the possible answers, ranging from the plausible to the fantastical, illuminate not only the fate of Henry Hudson, but the nature of the landscape that swallowed him and the indigenous world that existed, vast and complex and entirely indifferent to European ambitions in the spaces that European maps left blank. The most probable scenario is the simplest and the grimmest. 9 men in an open boat, several of them already too sick to function, with no meaningful provisions, no firearms. The mutineers kept the weapons of Araya, and no realistic prospect of navigating out of James Bay through Hudson Bay and back through the strait to the Atlantic. The distances involved were staggering. James Bay alone is roughly the size of Lake Superior. Hudson Bay beyond it dwarfs James Bay by a factor of 5. The strait connecting the bay to the Atlantic stretches for 450 miles of ice-choked, current-torn water that had nearly destroyed the Discovery even with a full crew and functioning rigging. In a 20-foot shallop, with oars and perhaps a crude sail manned by sick and starving men, the mathematics of survival were not merely unfavorable. They were essentially zero. The cold would have been the first enemy. June in James Bay is not summer as anyone south of the 55th parallel would understand it. Daytime temperatures hover near freezing. Nighttime temperatures drop well below it. The water temperature is barely above the point where it would solidify. Exposure in an open boat under these conditions without adequate clothing — Hudson had been seized in his nightclothes, remember, and the others had been given little time to dress — would produce hypothermia within hours. Wet clothing accelerates heat loss. Wind across open water accelerates it further. The human body, deprived of its core temperature, follows a predictable decline. Shivering, then confusion, then loss of motor control, then unconsciousness, then death. For the men already weakened by scurvy and starvation, this progression would have been rapid. If they survived the first night, and this is not certain, they would have faced the question of food. The shallop carried almost nothing. The mutineers had tossed down a few personal items, but the accounts do not describe any meaningful quantity of provisions being placed in the boat. Fishing was possible in theory, MY. James Bay supports populations of Arctic char, whitefish, and other species, but required equipment, skill, and a physical capacity that several of the occupants no longer possessed. Hunting along the shore was possible if they could reach it, but they had no firearms. And the game available in early summer along the James Bay coast, geese, ptarmigan, hare, required either traps or a degree of mobility that men weakened by months of deprivation could not sustain. The most likely reconstruction accepted by the majority of historians who have examined the question is that the shallop drifted in James Bay for days, perhaps weeks, its occupants dying one by one from exposure, starvation, and the cumulative effects of the scurvy that had been ravaging them since the previous winter. The bodies would have been committed to the water or left where they fell. The boat itself, a small wooden vessel with no ballast and no crew to manage it, would eventually have swamped, capsized, or drifted ashore on one of the countless uninhabited islands or stretches of coastline that line James Bay's southern and eastern margins. The wood would have rotted. The remains would have been scattered by animals and weather. Within a few seasons, there would have been nothing left to find. This is the probable truth, and it is unsatisfying precisely because it is probable. The human mind resists the idea that a man of Hudson's stature, a navigator who reshaped the map of the world, could simply have died of cold in a rowboat and vanished without trace. We want the ending to match the scale of the life. We want drama, or at least resolution. The silence that surrounds Hudson's death feels disproportionate, like a symphony that stops mid-movement. And so other theories have filled the silence. The second possibility, and the one that has generated the most persistent speculation, is that Hudson and some or all of his companions reached the shore and survived for a period among the indigenous Cree peoples who inhabited the James Bay coast. This theory rests on a handful of tantalizing but inconclusive pieces of evidence. In 1631, 20 years after Hudson's abandonment, the English explorer Thomas James, for whom James Bay is named, overwintered in the same general area where the Discovery had been frozen in. James reported finding no trace of Hudson or his companions, but his search was limited by his own desperate circumstances. More intriguing are reports from later decades, relayed through indigenous oral traditions and recorded by European traders, of encounters with people or artifacts that seem to suggest a European presence in the James Bay region predating the establishment of formal trading posts. None of these reports withstands rigorous scrutiny. The details are always secondhand, always filtered through multiple layers of translation and retelling, always lacking the specificity that would allow verification. A Cree elder tells a French trader about metal objects found on a distant shore. A trapper reports seeing markings on trees that resemble European script. A story circulates about a group of pale strangers who lived among a coastal band for a single winter before dying of illness. Each report, taken individually, is too vague to constitute evidence. Taken collectively, they create an atmosphere of possibility, the sense that the landscape itself might contain answers that have simply not been asked the right questions. The third theory is the most romantic and the least credible. It proposes that Hudson, drawing on his extraordinary navigational skills, managed to sail the shallop out of James Bay, through Hudson Bay, and into the strait, somehow navigating hundreds of miles of ice-choked water in an open boat with a crew of invalids, and either reached the Atlantic or perished in the attempt at some point far from where he was abandoned. This theory has no evidence to support it beyond the acknowledged fact of Hudson's exceptional seamanship. It requires a series of near-miraculous survivals occurring in sequence, each one individually improbable and collectively impossible. It persists not because it is plausible, but because it is consoling. It allows us to imagine Hudson dying as he lived in motion, pointed toward the next horizon, fighting the ice until the ice won. The truth almost certainly is colder and quieter than any of these narratives. Henry Hudson died in James Bay, probably within days or weeks of being cast adrift, of causes that were banal and absolute: cold, hunger, exposure, disease. His son died with him or near him in the same small boat or on the same desolate shore. The carpenter Philip Staff, who had chosen loyalty over survival, died alongside men he had volunteered to accompany. The 6 sailors who had been too weak to be useful to the mutineers died as they had lived for the preceding months, in pain and without agency. There was no final speech. There was no dramatic last stand. There was only the slow, ugly arithmetic of the human body running out of the fuel it needed to sustain itself, in a place where no one was watching and no one would come. The shallop itself has never been found. Numerous searches have been conducted over the centuries, amateur and professional, on foot and by air, using metal detectors and sonar and satellite imagery. The James Bay coast is vast, remote, and geologically active. Shorelines shift, rivers change course. The permafrost that underlies much of the region expands and contracts with the seasons, swallowing objects into the earth and occasionally disgorging them decades later. If the shallop came ashore anywhere along the southern James Bay coast, it is entirely possible that its remains lie buried beneath meters of sediment and organic debris, invisible to any search technology currently available. It is equally possible that the boat never reached shore at all, that it drifted until it swamped and sank in the deep, cold waters of the bay, where wooden objects can be preserved almost indefinitely by the near-freezing temperatures. Somewhere beneath the gray surface of James Bay, there may be a scatter of wooden planks and iron fittings resting on the silty bottom, 150 feet below the surface, the only physical evidence that Henry Hudson existed in a form more tangible than a name on a map. The search for Hudson's remains has become, in a peculiar way, a continuation of Hudson's own obsessive quest. Each new search expedition enters the same landscape, faces the same hostile conditions, and is driven by the same conviction that the answer lies just beyond the next headland, the next river mouth, the next stretch of unexplored coast. The searchers pursue Hudson the way Hudson pursued the passage. With more certainty than evidence, more determination than probability, sustained by the belief that absence of proof is not proof of absence. The parallel is uncomfortable but precise. The very quality that drew Hudson to his destruction, the inability to accept that some searches have no satisfying conclusion, is the quality that draws others to search for him. There is something almost recursive about this. A man who could not stop looking is now a man who cannot be found. The searcher has become the searched for, and the search itself has become a kind of passage, not through ice and water, but through time, into a mystery that the landscape guards with the same indifferent silence it has maintained for 4 centuries. We should turn now to the question of justice, or rather to the extraordinary absence of it that followed the Discovery's return to England. The ship arrived in London in September 1611, carrying a crew reduced by death and starvation to a handful of men barely capable of handling the vessel. They were emaciated, sick, and acutely aware that what they had done constituted a capital crime under English maritime law. Mutiny was not a matter of administrative discipline, it was a hanging offense. The men who had bound Henry Hudson, forced him into the shallop, and cut the tow line had committed an act that, under the legal framework of their time, warranted execution. The fact that several of the mutiny's principal architects, Greene and Wilson, were already dead did not absolve the survivors. English law did not require that all conspirators be alive for those who remained to face the rope. The survivors' first and most urgent task, therefore, was narrative construction. Before the authorities could interrogate them individually and compare inconsistencies, they needed a coherent account that distributed blame toward the dead and exonerated the living. The story they assembled, pieced together from Prickett's testimony, Bylot's navigational records, and the fragmented accounts of the remaining crew, was a masterwork of strategic omission and selective emphasis. In their telling, the mutiny was not a conspiracy but an eruption. The crew had been driven to the brink of death by a captain who was manifestly unfit to command. Hudson had hoarded food while his men starved. He had made and reversed decisions with a frequency that suggested mental deterioration. He had placed his trust in Henry Greene, a man of no maritime qualification, while antagonizing the experienced officers whose skills were essential to the ship's survival. The situation had reached a point where following the captain's orders was indistinguishable from following him to a collective grave. The mutiny was not rebellion. It was self-preservation. This narrative was effective because it contained enough truth to be plausible. Hudson's erratic behavior during the winter was corroborated by multiple witnesses. His redistribution of the food supply was documented. His favoritism toward Greene was widely known. The demotion of Juet was a matter of record. Each of these facts, presented in the right context and with the right emphasis, supported the interpretation that the mutineers were desperate men acting under intolerable circumstances rather than calculating criminals who had planned their captain's disposal. But the narrative also contained conspicuous gaps. It did not explain why the sick men had been put into the shallop. If the mutiny was about survival, why not simply confine Hudson and his closest allies below decks and sail for home under Bylot's navigation? Why cast 9 men, several of whom posed no threat to anyone, into a boat that offered no realistic chance of survival? The answer, unstated but obvious, was that the mutineers wanted witnesses eliminated. The sick men had seen too much. John Hudson would grow up to seek revenge. Philip Staff's voluntary departure had been an embarrassment that revealed the moral bankruptcy of the enterprise. The shallop was not a lifeboat, it was a grave with a sail. Prickett's account addressed this problem by emphasizing the chaos of the moment. The mutiny had happened quickly, decisions had been made in haste, and the allocation of who stayed and who went was determined more by proximity and circumstance than by deliberate calculation. It was a convenient explanation, and it was almost certainly a lie. The mutiny had been planned over days. The choice of who went into the shallop was deliberate, systematic, and strategic. The sick were removed because they were burdens. The loyal were removed because they were threats. The teenager was removed because he was an heir. The whole operation had the unmistakable character of men who had thought carefully about what they were doing and had resolved to do it thoroughly. The authorities were not fooled. The Admiralty's investigators were experienced men who had examined the testimony of returning sailors for decades and who understood the difference between a spontaneous act of desperation and a premeditated conspiracy. The questions they asked, recorded in fragmentary form in the Admiralty archives, probed the planning, the timing, and the selection criteria with a precision that suggests they knew exactly what had happened. They understood that Hudson had been murdered, not by a blade or a bullet, but by deliberate abandonment in conditions that made death a certainty. And then they performed the calculation that this entire story has been building toward. The calculation that explains why 9 men died without consequence. The calculation that reveals more clearly than any geographic discovery or commercial enterprise the true operating logic of the age of exploration. The men aboard the Discovery carried knowledge, not the abstract, theoretical knowledge of scholars and cartographers, but the lived, embodied knowledge of men who had physically been where no Englishman had been before. They knew the entrance to Hudson Strait, not as a line on a chart, but as a specific visual experience, a sequence of landmarks and currents and ice conditions that could guide a subsequent expedition through the passage. They knew the bay beyond, its approximate size, its coastal features, the behavior of its tides and ice. They knew the rivers emptying into the bay, the indigenous peoples inhabiting its shores, the game available for hunting, the timber available for building. This knowledge existed nowhere else. It had not been written down in sufficient detail to be transmitted through documents alone. It lived in the minds and memories of the men who had experienced it, and if those men were executed, the knowledge would die with them. England needed that knowledge. The competition with France, Spain, and the Netherlands for control of the North American interior was intensifying. The bay that Hudson had found offered England a strategic advantage that could reshape the balance of colonial power, but only if subsequent expeditions could reach it. And subsequent expeditions could reach it only if the men who had already made the journey were available to guide them. The mutineers were not merely criminals. They were repositories of irreplaceable geographic intelligence, abandoned. No formal acquittal was ever abandoned. No formal acquittal was ever issued. The legal record simply trails off into silence, the charges neither prosecuted nor dismissed, suspended in a bureaucratic limbo that allowed the authorities to maintain the fiction that justice might still be served while ensuring that it never would be. The mutineers walked free. Some disappeared into the anonymity of the London waterfront. Others continued their maritime careers without interruption. Robert Bylot's subsequent trajectory is the most instructive. Within 4 years of the mutiny, Bylot was back in the Arctic, serving as navigator aboard expeditions that built directly on Hudson's discoveries. He sailed with William Baffin in 1615 and 1616, exploring the waters north of Hudson Strait and charting coastlines that would not be revisited by Europeans for 2 centuries. His navigational skills, honed in no small part by his experience aboard the Discovery under Hudson's command, were considered so valuable that his participation in a mutiny that killed his captain was treated as an irrelevant biographical detail, a regrettable incident that bore no relation to his professional utility. The system had consumed Hudson and found Bylot more useful alive than punished. The transaction was complete. Prickett published his account. It entered the historical record as the primary narrative of the fourth voyage, the version of events that subsequent historians would cite, debate, and struggle to see past. Because Prickett survived, and because Prickett wrote, his perspective became the default lens through which the mutiny was viewed. Hudson, who wrote nothing after the shallop was cut loose, had no corresponding voice. The dead do not publish rebuttals. The historical record is written by survivors, and survivors have interests that shape their testimony in ways that are often invisible to later readers who encounter the text as neutral documentary evidence rather than the strategic self-presentation it actually is. This asymmetry, the eloquence of the survivors and the silence of the dead, is one of the most important and least discussed features of exploration history. We know the age of exploration primarily through the accounts of men who came back. The men who did not come back, who died of scurvy in uncharted harbors, who were killed by indigenous peoples defending their homelands, who starved in ice-locked ships or drowned in unmapped rapids, left behind at most a scattering of bones and artifacts, that speak only to the fact of their death, not to the experience of their living. The historical record is radically skewed toward the successful, the lucky, and the ruthless. The voices we hear are the voices of men who had reasons to present their own actions favorably and who faced no contradiction from the dead. Hudson's case is an extreme instance of this general pattern, but it is not unique. The age of exploration is full of similar silences. Men who vanished into landscapes that swallowed them without trace, whose stories were then told by the men who had abandoned, betrayed, or simply outlasted them. The narrative of exploration is, to a degree that is rarely acknowledged, a narrative written by the people who left other people behind. This recognition does not resolve the moral questions at the heart of Hudson's story. It does not tell us whether the mutineers were justified or whether Hudson's behavior had genuinely reached a point where his removal was necessary for the crew's survival, or whether the Admiralty's decision to prioritize intelligence over justice was defensible under the circumstances. These questions have no definitive answers because the evidence that might provide them lies at the bottom of James Bay, or in the unrecorded conversations of men who have been dead for 4 centuries. What the recognition does is shift the frame. It asks us to notice not just what is in the historical record, but what is absent from it, and to consider the possibility that the absences are as meaningful as the presences. The question of whether the mutineers were justified has been debated by historians since the events themselves, and the debate illuminates more about the values of the debaters than about the facts of the case. 19th century writers, steeped in the Victorian cult of the heroic explorer, tended to condemn the mutiny as an act of base treachery against a visionary leader. 20th century historians, more attentive to the evidence of Hudson's erratic command, were inclined to view the mutiny with greater sympathy, arguing that the crew faced a genuine survival crisis precipitated by a captain who had lost the ability to function. 21st century analyses have complicated the picture further by attending to the power dynamics, economic interests, and institutional structures that shaped the behavior of everyone involved. Not as free moral agents making choices in a vacuum, but as men embedded in systems of commerce, patronage, and maritime hierarchy that constrained their options in ways they may not have fully understood. The most honest assessment is probably the least satisfying. Everybody involved acted in ways that were simultaneously rational and monstrous. Hudson's decision to press south into James Bay, to spend the winter rather than retreat, and to withhold food from his crew was a sequence of choices that a man consumed by geographic obsession might reasonably make, and that a man with any awareness of his responsibilities to 22 other human lives would never have made. The mutineers' decision to seize the ship, remove the captain, and abandon him and 8 others to certain death was a sequence of choices that desperate, frightened men at the end of their endurance might reasonably make, and that men with any moral imagination would have found an alternative to. The Admiralty's decision to prioritize navigational intelligence over criminal prosecution was a sequence of choices that a strategic institution calculating national advantage might reasonably make, and that an institution with any commitment to the principle that murder should have consequences would have rejected. Everyone was rational. Everyone was monstrous. The two conditions coexisted without contradiction because the system within which these men operated, the system of commercial exploration that sent small ships into lethal environments in pursuit of trade routes, was itself both rational and monstrous. It produced extraordinary geographic knowledge. It consumed human lives with the indifference of a machine consuming fuel. It rewarded the men who brought back data and discarded the men who did not. It called this process discovery, and it celebrated it as progress, and it built empires on the information extracted from the suffering of the men it sent north. Hudson was both the system's greatest product and its most conspicuous casualty. He was shaped by its incentives, driven by its rewards, and destroyed by its logic. The very qualities the system cultivated in him, the obsessive focus on geographic objectives, the willingness to sacrifice comfort and safety for data, the conviction that the next voyage would justify the last, were the qualities that isolated him from his crew, alienated his officers, and created the conditions for his murder. The system built him, used him, and threw him away. Then it named a river after him and called the account settled. 4 centuries after the tow line was cut, the geography that Hudson mapped has become a contested space in ways he could never have anticipated, and the contest illuminates how thoroughly his discoveries permeated the structures of power that followed him. Consider the bay itself, that enormous ice-locked body of water that Hudson mistook for a potential passage, and that became instead the foundation of a commercial empire. Hudson Bay today is not merely a geographic feature. It is a legal concept, a jurisdictional boundary, a site of competing sovereignty claims, and a living laboratory for the study of climate change. The indigenous Cree and Inuit communities that have inhabited its shores for millennia, the same peoples whose ancestors watched the Discovery anchor in their waters in 1610, are now engaged in legal and political struggles over land rights, resource extraction, and environmental stewardship that trace their origins directly to the charter King Charles II signed in 1670, granting the Hudson's Bay Company dominion over a territory the Crown had no legitimate authority to give. Rupert's Land, that 1.5 million square mile territory defined by the drainage basin of Hudson Bay, was transferred from the Hudson's Bay Company to the newly formed Dominion of Canada in 1870, 2 centuries after the charter was issued. The transfer was negotiated between the company and the Canadian government. The indigenous nations who actually inhabited the territory were not consulted. Their exclusion from the transaction was not an oversight. It was consistent with the legal fiction that had governed the region since 1670. The fiction that European discovery conferred ownership, that a charter signed in London could transfer sovereignty over lands that European feet had barely touched, and that the peoples who had lived on those lands for thousands of years possessed no rights that the charter was obligated to recognize. This legal fiction, for the doctrine of discovery as it came to be known, was one of the foundational principles of European colonialism, and its application to the Hudson Bay watershed demonstrates how a single navigator's observations could be transmuted, through layers of legal and commercial abstraction, into an instrument of dispossession so vast that its consequences are still being adjudicated in Canadian courts. Hudson charted a coastline. The Admiralty claimed the coastline. The Crown granted the claim to a company. The company administered the territory as a commercial fief. The territory was transferred to a nation-state. The nation-state imposed its legal system on the indigenous inhabitants. And at every step in this chain, the original act of charting, of rendering an indigenous landscape into European cartographic notation, served as the foundational legitimizing gesture. The map preceded the flag preceded the law preceded the dispossession, and it all began with a man in a small ship writing numbers in a logbook. The modern consequences of this chain are concrete and ongoing. In 1975, the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement, one of the first modern land claims treaties in Canadian history, attempted to address the rights of the Cree and Inuit communities living along the shores of James Bay and Hudson Bay. The agreement was prompted by a massive hydroelectric development project that proposed to dam and divert rivers flowing into James Bay, flooding vast areas of indigenous territory and fundamentally altering the ecology of the region. The Cree communities affected by the project argued that their rights to the land predated any European claim, that the Hudson's Bay Company Charter was illegitimate, and that the Canadian government's authority over the territory was derived from a chain of title that had never included Indigenous consent. The legal battle that ensued was, in a sense, a 4-century delayed reckoning with the events of 1610. The Cree were arguing in the language of 20th century law that Henry Hudson's arrival in James Bay had initiated a process of dispossession that had never been legally justified and that continued to produce material harm. The government was arguing with equal conviction that the chain of title, from Hudson's observations to the Crown's claim to the company's charter to Confederation, constituted a legitimate legal foundation for Canadian sovereignty over the territory. The agreement that was eventually reached, which provided the Cree and Inuit with financial compensation, land rights, and a degree of self-governance in exchange for allowing the hydroelectric project to proceed was a compromise that satisfied neither side fully and that both sides recognized as incomplete. The rivers that were dammed and diverted as part of the James Bay project were rivers that emptied into the same waters where Hudson's shallop had drifted after the mutiny. The landscape that was flooded to create reservoirs for hydroelectric generation was the same landscape that Hudson had scanned from the deck of the Discovery, searching for the outlet that would carry him to the Pacific. The irony is not subtle, but it is worth stating explicitly. The geography that Hudson explored in pursuit of a commercial passage to Asia became, 3.5 centuries later, the site of a different kind of commercial exploitation: the harnessing of northern rivers for electrical power. And the indigenous peoples whose homeland Hudson had passed through without acknowledgement found themselves once again bearing the costs of a project conceived by distant institutions for distant markets. The hydroelectric development of the James Bay watershed is one of the largest engineering projects in human history. The La Grande complex alone, a series of dams, dikes, and reservoirs on the La Grande River, generates more than 16,000 megawatts of electrical power, enough to supply the needs of millions of people. The environmental transformation it produced was proportionally enormous. River courses were altered, water tables shifted, vast areas of boreal forest were submerged. Mercury, released from newly flooded soils and vegetation, accumulated in fish populations to levels that made them dangerous for human consumption. A particular cruelty for Cree communities whose diet had been centered on freshwater fish for generations. Caribou migration routes were disrupted. The ecological web that had sustained indigenous life in the region for millennia was restructured around the requirements of turbines and transmission lines. The benefits of this restructuring accrued primarily to populations far to the south, the cities and industries of southern Quebec and the northeastern United States, which purchased James Bay electricity through long-distance transmission networks. The costs accrued primarily to the indigenous communities who lived in the immediate vicinity of the development. This distribution of costs and benefits, extraction from the periphery for the benefit of the center, is a pattern so consistent in the history of the Hudson Bay watershed that it functions as a kind of geographic destiny embedded in the landscape itself since the moment European commercial interests first perceived the bay as a resource to be exploited rather than a homeland to be respected. And yet the story is not one of unrelieved indigenous victimhood, because the Cree and Inuit communities of the James Bay region have demonstrated over the decades since the 1975 agreement a capacity for political organization, legal advocacy, and cultural resilience that complicates any simple narrative of dispossession. The Cree Nation government, aimed the political entity that emerged from the James Bay Agreement, has negotiated subsequent agreements that have progressively expanded indigenous authority over territory resources and governance. Cree communities have used the revenues from the hydroelectric agreements to fund education, healthcare, housing, and cultural preservation programs. The Cree language, spoken by the same peoples whose ancestors inhabited the James Bay coast when Hudson arrived, is one of the healthiest indigenous languages in Canada, taught in schools and used in daily life across the region. The story of the James Bay Cree is not the story of a people erased by colonial contact. It is the story of a people who endured colonial contact and emerged from it with their identity, their language, and their connection to the land substantially intact. This resilience stands in pointed contrast to the fate of Hudson himself, who was erased so thoroughly that even the manner of his death remains unknown. The Cree endured, Hudson vanished. The indigenous communities that European explorers routinely dismissed as obstacles or curiosities proved, over the long arc of history, to be more durable than the explorers themselves. There is a lesson in this that the age of exploration was constitutionally incapable of learning. That the peoples encountered by European navigators were not bit players in a European drama, but protagonists of their own stories, stories that had been unfolding for thousands of years before any European ship appeared on the horizon, and that would continue to unfold long after the ships had gone. The river tells a parallel story, though its trajectory diverged sharply from the bay's. The Hudson River did not become the site of a commercial monopoly like the Hudson's Bay Company. It became something both more diffuse and more consequential, the geographic spine of the most economically dynamic region in the Western Hemisphere. The transformation of the Hudson River Valley from an indigenous homeland into the corridor of American commerce is a story that has been told many times and from many perspectives, but its connection to Henry Hudson specifically is worth tracing, because it illustrates how a single act of exploration, a few weeks of sailing up a river and back, can set in motion cascading consequences that reshape the world in ways the explorer neither intended nor could have imagined. When the Dutch established New Amsterdam at the mouth of the Hudson in the 1620s, the settlement's commercial logic was simple and direct. Furs came down the river, manufactured goods went up the river, and the harbor at the river's mouth was where the exchange between European markets and American resources occurred. This logic persisted through the Dutch period, through the English takeover, through the American Revolution, and into the early decades of the United States. The Hudson River was New York's lifeline, the geographic feature that connected the port to its hinterland and gave the city its commercial reason for existence. But the river's true strategic significance was not fully realized until 1825, when the Erie Canal was completed, connecting the Hudson River at Albany to Lake Erie at Buffalo. The canal was an engineering marvel. 363 miles of artificial waterway carved through the wilderness of upstate New York, lifting boats over the Appalachian Barrier through a series of 83 locks. Its effect on the American economy was transformative and almost instantaneous. Before the canal, the cost of shipping a ton of goods from Buffalo to New York City was approximately $100, a prohibitive expense that effectively isolated the Great Lakes region from Atlantic markets. After the canal, the cost dropped to approximately $10. The economic barrier separating the American interior from the coast, a barrier as formidable, in commercial terms, as any range of mountains, collapsed overnight. The consequences cascaded. Agricultural products from the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes region poured down the canal and into the Hudson, turning New York City into the primary port for American agricultural exports. Immigration flowed in the opposite direction. European settlers traveling up the Hudson, through the canal, and into the interior, populating the Midwest with a speed that would have been impossible without the waterway connecting the coast to the lakes. Cities bloomed along the canal's route: Rochester, Syracuse, Utica, and at its western terminus, Buffalo became one of the fastest-growing cities in the nation. New York City, positioned at the other end of this commercial pipeline, cemented its dominance over American trade, finance, and culture in ways that persist to the present day. The Erie Canal was, in its essence, an extension of the geographic logic that Hudson had identified in 1609. The river penetrated the continent. The canal extended that penetration to the Great Lakes. Together, they created a continuous waterway from the Atlantic Ocean to the heart of North America. Not the passage to the Pacific that Hudson had been seeking, but a commercial corridor of immense value that achieved, by different means, the economic objective that had motivated the search for a passage in the first place. The merchants who funded the canal understood this connection explicitly. They were not building a passage to China. They were building a passage to the American interior, and the passage began where Hudson had begun, at the mouth of the river in the harbor of New York. The financial infrastructure that grew up around this commercial corridor became, over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, the most powerful concentration of capital in human history. Wall Street, named, remember, for the defensive wall that the Dutch had built across the northern boundary of New Amsterdam, evolved from a local market for trading government bonds into the nerve center of global finance. The New York Stock Exchange, founded in 1792 under a buttonwood tree a few hundred yards from the waterfront where Dutch ships had once unloaded beaver pelts, became the institution through which the wealth of an industrializing nation was organized, concentrated, and deployed. The banks, insurance companies, and investment firms that clustered along the lower Manhattan waterfront drew their original commercial energy from the same geographic advantage that had attracted the Dutch in the first place: the deep harbor, the navigable river, the access to the interior. The geography was Hudson's discovery. Everything that grew from it was the work of centuries of human ambition building on the foundation he had laid. The connection between a 17th century navigator sailing a borrowed Dutch ship up an unnamed river and the emergence of New York as the capital of global finance is not metaphorical. It is causal. Each link in the chain, Dutch trading post, English colony, American port, canal terminus, financial center, follows logically from the geographic advantages of the site. And those advantages were first identified, charted, and reported to the European world by Henry Hudson. He did not envision Wall Street. He did not imagine a city of 8 million people occupying the islands at the river's mouth. He was looking for a passage to China and found instead a river that dead-ended in the mountains. But the dead end proved more valuable than any passage could have been because the river did not need to reach China to be transformative. It only needed to reach the interior, and it did. The cultural consequences of the Hudson River's development are as significant as the commercial ones, though they are less frequently connected to Hudson himself. The river and its valley became, in the early 19th century, the cradle of a distinctly American artistic tradition. The Hudson River School, the first coherent movement in American landscape painting, took the river and its surrounding terrain as both subject and inspiration. Thomas Cole, Frederick Edwin Church, Albert Bierstadt and their contemporaries painted the Hudson Valley's mountains, forests, and waterways with a luminous intensity that both celebrated the American landscape and mourned its transformation by industrial development. Their canvases, enormous, light-saturated panoramas of a wilderness that was already disappearing, became the visual vocabulary through which Americans understood their relationship to the natural world. The paintings were, in a sense, a delayed artistic response to the geographic revelation that Hudson had initiated. Before Europeans charted the river, the landscape it flowed through was not scenery in the European sense. It was a homeland, inhabited and managed by indigenous peoples whose relationship to the land was practical, spiritual, and sustained over millennia. The transformation of that landscape into aesthetic spectacle, into something to be painted, admired, and consumed by audiences in distant galleries, was a byproduct of the same process that had transformed it into commercial resource. The river that carried beaver pelts in the 17th century carried agricultural products in the 18th, carried tourists in the 19th, and carries commuters in the 21st. At each stage, its meaning was redefined by the people exploiting it, and at each stage, the redefinition erased a layer of what had come before. The erasure was most complete and most consequential for the indigenous peoples who had inhabited the river valley before Hudson's arrival. The Lenape, who occupied the lower valley and the islands at the river's mouth, were progressively displaced by Dutch and then English settlement, pushed westward across New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and eventually into Oklahoma, their homeland reduced to a few place names on the map of a city that had been built on their dispossession. The Mohican, who controlled the upper valley, suffered a similar trajectory. Disease, warfare, and colonial expansion driving them from their ancestral territory over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries. By the time the Erie Canal was completed in 1825, turning the Hudson Valley into the busiest commercial corridor in America, the indigenous peoples who had greeted Hudson's ship with offerings of tobacco and dried fruit had been so thoroughly removed from the landscape that their prior existence had become, for most of the valley's new inhabitants, invisible. This invisibility is itself a form of legacy, a negative legacy defined by absence rather than presence, but no less real for being unacknowledged. The indigenous nations of the Hudson Valley did not simply disappear. They were displaced by a process that began with Hudson's reconnaissance and accelerated with each subsequent wave of European exploitation. Their removal was not incidental to the valley's development. It was prerequisite to it. The farms, the towns, the canal, the railroad, the factories, the suburbs, all of the layers of human activity that have accumulated in the Hudson Valley over 4 centuries rest on land that was taken from its original inhabitants through some combination of treaty, fraud, and force. Henry Hudson did not set this process in motion deliberately, for he was searching for a passage, not claiming territory, but his account of the river's depth, its navigability, its access to a fur-rich interior, and the susceptibility of its indigenous people to European goods, a susceptibility that suggested to the European mind an openness to European control, supplied the intelligence that made dispossession possible. The Hudson River now flows through a landscape so thoroughly transformed from what Hudson encountered that the navigator would scarcely recognize anything he saw in 1609. The forests that once lined its banks have given way to cities, suburbs, industrial sites, and, along the river's upper reaches, a patchwork of farms, second-growth woodland, and protected parkland. The water itself, once clear enough to see the bottom at considerable depth, was by the 20th century so contaminated by industrial effluent that the river was essentially biologically dead along significant stretches of its length. General Electric's discharge of polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, into the upper Hudson from its capacitor manufacturing plants in Hudson Falls and Fort Edward created one of the most extensive Superfund cleanup sites in American history. The river that Hudson had described as abundant with fish became, for decades, a waterway whose fish were too toxic to eat. The cleanup of the Hudson, ongoing since the 1970s and still incomplete, represents a different kind of reckoning with the consequences of Hudson's discovery. Not a legal reckoning like the James Bay Treaty negotiations, but an ecological one. The river was exploited for 4 centuries with essentially no consideration for its biological integrity. The same commercial logic that had drawn Dutch traders to the river in the 17th century, the logic that valued the river as a resource to be extracted from rather than an ecosystem to be sustained, persisted through the industrial era, producing contamination on a scale that will require decades more to remediate. The Hudson River is now the subject of one of the most ambitious environmental restoration efforts in the world, a project that explicitly acknowledges the cumulative damage of centuries of exploitation and attempts to reverse it. Whether the river can be fully restored is an open question. Ecosystems do not recover on human timescales. The PCBs buried in the river's sediments will persist for generations. The species that were extirpated, the sturgeon that once filled the river in numbers so vast that they were called Albany beef, the oyster beds that lined the harbor of New York, the shad runs that had sustained indigenous and colonial communities alike, may never return to their historical abundance. The river will survive. It will continue to flow from the Adirondacks to the sea, as it has for millions of years. But it will be a different river from the one Hudson navigated, altered, diminished, carrying in its water and its sediments the chemical signature of everything that has been done to it since a man in a borrowed ship sailed up its length and pronounced it insufficient for his purposes. The strait, Hudson Strait, remains the least transformed of Hudson's 3 major discoveries, largely because its remoteness and hostility have limited human exploitation to a degree that the river and the bay's southern reaches have not enjoyed. The strait is still, in the 21st century, one of the most dangerous navigational passages in the world. Ice chokes it for 8 to 9 months of the year. The currents remain ferocious. The weather remains brutal. Modern icebreakers can transit the strait with relative safety during the summer months, and cargo ships supplying the communities of northern Canada pass through it regularly, but the passage retains the essential character that Hudson experienced, a narrow ice-filled gauntlet connecting 2 vast bodies of water, demanding respect from any vessel that enters it. Climate change is altering the strait, as it is altering every component of the Arctic system. Ice coverage is declining. The navigable season is lengthening. The strait that Hudson fought through in June and July of 1610 is now passable, in some years from late June through November, a navigable window roughly twice as long as what Hudson would have experienced. This expansion of the navigable season has practical implications for the communities that depend on marine shipping for supplies and strategic implications for the nations that claim sovereignty over the waters of the Canadian Arctic. But the strait itself, the physical geography of rock, water, and ice that Hudson was the first European to fully transit, endures in a form that his eyes would still recognize. The tides still run with lethal force. The icebergs still drift through in shapes that defy description. The fog still descends without warning. The compass still behaves erratically. Of all the landscapes Hudson touched, the Strait is the one that has most successfully resisted the transformative power of the civilization that followed in his wake. This resistance has a quality that feels almost intentional, as if the geography itself has maintained a kind of fidelity to the moment of Hudson's passage that the river and the bay have not. The Strait does not bear the scars of 4 centuries of exploitation. It has not been dammed, diverted, contaminated, or commercially developed beyond recognition. It remains what it was, a passage, dangerous and beautiful, connecting one body of water to another through a channel of ice and stone. It is the closest thing Henry Hudson has to an unchanged monument, and it exists not because anyone chose to preserve it, but because the landscape itself proved too formidable to be subdued. There is one more landscape that belongs to this story, though it appears on no map that Hudson ever drew and bears no name that any cartographer ever assigned. It is the landscape of memory itself, the space in which a man who left almost no personal record has been reconstructed, reimagined, and mythologized by 4 centuries of writers, painters, politicians, and ordinary people searching for meaning in the story of his life and disappearance. The mythologization began almost immediately. By the mid-17th century, barely a generation after the mutiny, Hudson had been absorbed into the folklore of the Dutch settlements along the river he had explored. Washington Irving, writing in 1809, would crystallize this process in his satirical History of New York, in which Hudson appears as a figure of comic grandeur, a captain of almost supernatural taciturnity, commanding a crew of hard-drinking Dutchmen through a landscape haunted by spirits and ancient magic. Irving's Hudson is not a historical person. He is a literary character, stripped of his English nationality, his obsessive psychology, and his violent end, and recast as the founding spirit of a uniquely American mythology, the ghost in the machine of New York's origin story. Irving's most famous contribution to this mythology was, of course, the story of Rip Van Winkle, published in 1819, a tale in which a colonial Dutchman wanders into the Catskill Mountains and encounters the ghosts of Hudson's crew playing ninepins in a hollow among the peaks, their thunder echoing down the valley like a memory the landscape itself refuses to release. Van Winkle drinks from their flagon, falls asleep for 20 years, and wakes to find the world transformed. The colonies become a nation, the king replaced by a president, the familiar contours of his life erased by the passage of time he slept through. The story is usually read as an allegory of the American Revolution, but its deeper resonance lies in its treatment of Hudson and his men as permanent residents of the landscape, and spirits embedded in the geography, haunting the mountains that rise above the river, their presence felt in every thunderstorm that rolls through the valley. Irving understood something about Hudson's story that the historians of his era did not. He understood that Hudson's disappearance, the absolute unresolved vanishing of a man into a landscape, had created a narrative vacuum that the human imagination would inevitably fill. A man whose death is witnessed and recorded becomes a historical figure, fixed in time, available for assessment and judgment. A man who simply vanishes becomes something else, a presence defined by absence, a question that the landscape itself seems to pose every time a fog rolls across the water or a storm breaks over the mountains. Hudson's lack of a confirmed death made him, paradoxically, more alive in the cultural imagination than any confirmed burial could have. He became the ghost of the geography he had mapped, a figure simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, his name written across the landscape in letters so large that they had become invisible to the people who lived among them. The painters followed the writers. The Hudson River School artists, for all their focus on landscape and light, were painting a territory that carried Hudson's name and his implicit presence, every canvas depicting the river. Cole's view from Mount Holyoke with its sweeping oxbow, Church's luminous vistas of the Catskills at sunset, Bierstadt's dramatic compositions of mountain and cloud was, whether the artist intended it or not, a portrait of Hudson's legacy. The river was his discovery. The landscape was his bequest. The paintings that celebrated it were, in a sense, posthumous portraits of a man who was never painted in life, not images of his face, which no artist ever recorded, but images of the world he had opened to European perception, rendered in oils and light by men who understood that the landscape was the only monument Hudson would ever receive. The political appropriation of Hudson's name followed a different trajectory. As New York grew from a colonial trading post into the commercial capital of the United States, Hudson was elevated from historical figure to civic saint, the founding navigator whose discovery had made everything that followed possible. His name was attached not only to the river and the bay and the strait, but to bridges, tunnels, parks, counties, cities, and a bewildering variety of commercial enterprises. The Hudson River Railroad, the Hudson Motor Car Company, the Hudson River Valley Greenway, the Henry Hudson Parkway running along the western edge of Manhattan, carrying millions of commuters annually over a route that traces, with eerie fidelity, the shoreline Hudson sailed past in September 1609. Each naming was an act of civic memory, an acknowledgement that the city's relationship to its geographic foundation was mediated by the man who had first charted that geography for European eyes. But civic memory is selective, and the Hudson it chose to remember bore little resemblance to the man who had actually lived. The civic Hudson was a hero of discovery, brave, visionary, and conveniently dead before the consequences of his discovery could complicate his reputation. The historical Hudson, erratic, obsessive, incapable of managing human relationships, responsible for the suffering and death of men who trusted him, was quietly set aside. The mutiny was acknowledged as a tragedy, but rarely examined as a consequence of Hudson's own behavior. The abandonment of indigenous peoples' claims to the territories he had mapped was treated as a historical inevitability rather than a moral choice. The ecological devastation that followed the commercial exploitation of the river valley was disconnected from the act of exploration that had initiated it. Hudson was, in the civic imagination, a beginning without consequences, a pure origin point, unburdened by the weight of what his discoveries had produced. This sanitization is not unique to Hudson. It is the standard treatment that founding figures receive from the societies that claim them. Statues depict explorers gazing into the distance with expressions of noble determination, not arguing with mutinous first mates over food distribution. Schools teach the discovery of rivers and bays as triumphs of human courage, not as the first steps in processes of dispossession and ecological transformation that would unfold over centuries. The narrative of exploration is, in its popular form, a narrative of firsts. The first European to see this, to chart that, to reach the other. And the framing of these events as firsts implicitly erases everything that existed before the European arrival. The river had no beginning. It had been flowing for millions of years. The peoples who lived along it had been navigating its waters, fishing its depths, and incorporating its rhythms into their cultural lives for thousands of years before Hudson arrived. To call his voyage a discovery is to adopt a perspective so narrow that it excludes the majority of the river's human history. But it is the perspective that has prevailed because the societies that emerged from European colonization wrote the textbooks, built the monuments, and named the parkways. The tension between Hudson as historical figure and Hudson as cultural symbol has intensified in recent decades, as the broader reckoning with colonial history has forced a re-examination of the narratives that societies tell about their origins. The 400th anniversary of Hudson's voyage up the river, celebrated in 2009, occasioned both celebration and protest. Official commemorations honored Hudson's navigational achievements and their role in New York's founding. Indigenous activists and their allies organized counter-commemorations that drew attention to the Lenape and Mahaican peoples whose displacement had been the unacknowledged cost of the city's creation. The two narratives, celebration and critique, occupied the same geographic space without resolution, each claiming the river as evidence for a different interpretation of history. This unresolved coexistence may be the most honest possible relationship to Hudson's legacy. The discovery was real. The river was charted. The harbor was identified. The geographic intelligence was transmitted, and the consequences that followed were vast, transformative, and irreversible. These facts cannot be wished away by moral discomfort with the processes they initiated. But the costs were also real: the displacement, the ecological damage, the erasure of indigenous presence from the narrative of a landscape they had inhabited for millennia. These facts cannot be wished away by civic pride in the city that grew from the exploitation of the river's resources. The two truths exist simultaneously, and the landscape holds them both without preference. The river flowing past the financial towers of Manhattan and the PCB remediation sites upstate with equal indifference, carrying the sediment of 4 centuries of human activity toward a harbor that no longer remembers why it was chosen. And here at the end, we return to the shallop. It is still there in a sense, not as a physical object, which has long since dissolved into the waters or the earth of James Bay, but as an image that refuses to fade from the story of exploration. The small boat, the bound captain, the teenage son, the sick men who could not stand, the growing distance between the shallop and the ship. The image persists because it captures, with a compression that no historian could improve upon, the essential transaction at the heart of the age of exploration. A man is used until his usefulness is exhausted, then he is discarded. The knowledge he gathered is preserved. The man himself is not. Every age has its version of this transaction. The language changes. The mechanisms grow more sophisticated. The shallops become metaphorical rather than literal. But the underlying logic, the willingness to extract value from human beings, and then abandon them when the extraction is complete, has proved remarkably durable. Hudson was not the first person to experience it, and the 4 centuries since his disappearance have produced no shortage of successors. The specific cruelty of his case lies in its transparency. There was no pretense, no face-saving narrative was constructed until after the fact. The mutineers cut the rope and sailed away, and the system that received them home performed its calculation in full view of history and chose the charts over the man who drew them. The question that lingers, the question that has pulled generation after generation of historians, searchers, and storytellers back to the gray waters of James Bay, is not really about what happened to Hudson's body. It is about what his story means, whether the age of exploration was a chapter of human achievement or human cruelty, whether the discoveries that reshaped the world were worth the lives they consumed, whether the maps we inherited are monuments or indictments. The question has no answer because it is not, finally, a question about Hudson. It is a question about us, about the societies we built on the geographic intelligence that men like Hudson extracted from the world at the cost of their lives, and about whether we have reckoned honestly with the price that was paid. The evidence suggests we have not. The river still bears his name, the bay still bears his name, the strait still bears his name, but the name has become a label, a cartographic convention drained of its original human content, attached to geographic features that millions of people encounter daily without knowing or caring that they were named for a man who died in an open boat, abandoned by his own crew, in a place so remote that even his bones could not be found. The name is everywhere. The man is nowhere. This is the condition that Hudson's story has reached after 4 centuries, a condition of maximum geographic presence and maximum personal absence. His identity dissolved into the landscape like salt dissolved in the sea, detectable in theory, but invisible in practice. A presence that can be named but not located, mapped but not found. And perhaps that is the most fitting monument the age of exploration could produce. Not a statue or a plaque or a ceremony, but an absence, a space on the map where a man should be and is not, a name without a grave, a discovery without a discoverer. The geographic features remain as solid and measurable as the day they were charted. The rivers flow, the bays freeze and thaw. The straits fill with ice and empty again in an annual rhythm that predates human observation and will outlast human memory. The landscape endures. The man who mapped it does not. And the distance between those two facts, between the permanence of geography and the fragility of the person who charts it, is the final irreducible lesson of Henry Hudson's life. Somewhere beneath the surface of James Bay, or scattered along its shore, or dissolved entirely into the chemistry of water and soil and time, there are traces of a small wooden boat that once carried a father and his son. The boat was not designed for the waters it was forced into. It was a vessel for sheltered coasts, for short trips between ship and shore, for the kind of modest, everyday work that no one remembers because it does not end in catastrophe. On the morning of June 22, 1611, it was repurposed as a coffin. The men who placed 9 human beings inside it did so with the knowledge that they were condemning them to death, and they performed the act with a briskness that suggests they had long since made their peace with what they were doing. The tow line was cut. The Discovery sailed north. The shallop grew small against the water and then grew smaller still, and then could no longer be distinguished from the gray surface of the bay. Henry Hudson watched the ship go. We cannot know this. No witness survived to tell us what he did or said in those final visible moments. But the logic of the man as we have come to understand him across 4 voyages, across 4 increasingly desperate encounters with the limits of the navigable world, suggests that he watched. He was a man who looked at horizons. He had spent his entire recorded life staring at the line where water met sky, searching for the gap, the opening, the passage that would carry him through to what lay beyond. The ship that had been his instrument for this lifelong act of looking was now the object being looked at, receding, diminishing, becoming a shape, and then a smudge, and then nothing, swallowed by the same geography that Hudson had spent his life trying to master. He would have understood in that moment that the horizon he had always been sailing toward had finally come for him instead, that the distance he had spent his life trying to close had closed around him, that the passage he had been seeking, the route through the ice, through the unknown, through the blank spaces on the map, had opened at last, and it led not to the Pacific but to the silence that waits at the end of every voyage that is not survived. His son stood beside him. The sick men lay in the bottom of the boat. The carpenter who had chosen loyalty sat among them. The water of James Bay moved beneath the hull with a slow, cold patience that had nothing to do with the men floating on its surface, and everything to do with the tides and currents and continental forces that had shaped this body of water over geological time. Forces so vast that the presence of 9 human beings in a small boat registered as nothing, less than nothing, a disturbance so minor that the water would not remember it for a second after it ceased. The shallop drifted. The light of the subarctic morning lay flat and pale across the water. Somewhere to the north, the Discovery's sails caught the wind that would carry the mutineers toward the Strait, toward the Atlantic, toward London, toward the calculation that would define what Hudson's life had meant. Somewhere in every other direction, the landscape that Hudson had charted, the coastlines, the rivers, the frozen expanse of the bay, continued in its ancient patterns, indifferent to the drama playing out on its surface, holding its secrets in the same silence it had maintained for 10,000 years before Hudson arrived, and would maintain for 10,000 years after. The water was cold. The sky was gray. The distance was absolute. And then the record ends, and the silence begins. And the silence has not been broken yet.